Aegon had been crowned when the conquest began, or arguably before it began. No one had actually bent a single knee other than people who had already bent their knee to him as their lord. But now that it was nearing completion, a second crowning became more sensible. And it made sense for a variety of reasons. He had wanted all along as a strategy to demonstrate his power as a dragon lord first, and then as a king. And with that power, to overwhelm everyone. And what better way to demonstrate that by being ordained by the most powerful religious leader in the biggest city, with Balerion on hand for all to see? None could doubt the stories they had heard of the ease in which the Targaryens had subjugated dynasties that had ruled for eons. Everyone would know, and everyone would know why. But even with all those eyes on the dragons, with all those knees bent to the Conqueror, and even with the seven above seemingly accepting Aegon as their king, there remained many who did not. They didn't see it that way. Some chose independence, some descended into, I'd say chose chaos, but more like chaos chose them. Some followed different gods, so the ordaining of the High Septon didn't mean as much. But all would pay a high price for their shot at freedom. And I say shot because not all would be successful. Today, we discuss the Unbowed and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. We are live almost every 3 p.m. Eastern on YouTube on Sundays. You can catch the video anytime afterwards or an edited version on Spotify, and the audio-only version is available everywhere you listen to podcasts, and it's ad-free if you listen on Patreon. Sean, what do you got to drink today? I'm boring as usual. Chocolate coffee in a thermos. You know, I'm consistent at least.
I do think that your shirt is kind of Halloween evocative. That castle looks like a ghost face with a flaming head.
You're right. It's a high tower shirt. We light the way. The tower does kind of have eyes and a mouth, and I don't know, like a carrot top head here, I guess you could say. Yeah, it's jack-o'-lantern-ish, but tower style.
Yeah. That's why it's screaming. It's
yeah, it's like, my head's on fire. No, I'm carrot top.
I try to make an orangish drink. It's kind of creamy. You know, the naked protein drinks haven't been, the naked drinks are there, but not the protein ones. So I've had to branch out. This is the mango naked drink, but with the Bolt House vanilla protein drink, and of course Mountain Dew. So kind of orangey, Halloweeny.
Yeah,
sweet like candy.
And crazy, just crazy, and kind of scary like Halloween too, because you know I'm afraid of what that would taste like.
I thought my Brandzik shirt was pretty Halloween evocative too.
Yes,
Demon Horn brand.
Indeed. So shout out to our excellent and smart friend Nina, who has received a question on her blog, goodqueenally.tumblr.com, with one L in Alley. If Tywin was to remarry, what kind of marriage alliance would he look for? It obviously wouldn't be a marriage for love. What would he aim for? So check goodqueenally.tumblr.com for how Nina responds to this question. It's not straightforward, yet it is straightforward. I like her answer quite a bit.
I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but it makes me think, why didn't Tywin remarry? It seems like that would have been a valuable strategic
he didn't want to.
Political move.
Simple as that. He did not want to, and he thinks he's above it.
Yeah, he's above it. He's willing to tell people, you need to do this, you need to do that. But when it comes down to it, he's not willing to do it.
Yeah, he's a huge hypocrite. We've said it a million times, and here's another chance to point it out. Yes.
Nina, but I wonder if
in her post,
if someone had confronted him.
Who?
If someone had said,
literally, who would confront Tywin?
Let's say Kevin.
Like, seriously, who
something.
confronts Tywin?
Let's say Kevin does.
Kevin, he'll shut him down.
Exactly.
Tywin's like, you have no authority over me. I'm not talking about this. That's what he did to anyone who even remotely brought it up.
Yeah, so, like maybe.
But do you think internally it was just like he hadn't gotten over his wife, or?
Oh yes, of course. Like there's no replacing her. Like she was perfect for him, and there's no replacing either who she was or the circumstances, their upbringing, as well as someone who was not too close to him in terms of their views on incest, but still within the close enough to him that he could see her as an equal or someone that's not beneath him, maybe if not an equal, not someone way far beneath him. So yeah, basically a huge hypocrite and very proud. The combination therein, and a bad father. Yeah, all those things. We loved it. We love to talk bad about Tywin because it's so easy.
Yeah, and you know what? That all rubbed off on his kids. I think that's fair way to describe all his kids.
Absolutely,
and
proud,
arrogant or whatever. Yeah.
And it's very, very well written. All of that. The reason he evokes such, like, I was like, who would talk about it? Like, because Tywin, like, it's personal. Like, we've thought about him so much, and it's sunk in, and it bleeds into real world stuff, like how
the fact that it can cause frustration. The fact that it can cause real frustration in you thinking about it means it had to be written really well.
Yeah, exactly. It just come full circle on this. Like, why did that slightly bother me just now? Because it's so well done and it's realistic, and it's like, damn, bad fathers really can bring that anger streak out. So anyway, yeah. So questions, if you have any questions, whether they're live or something occurs to you while you're listening, while we're not live, send it to westeroshistory@gmail.com or type it in the comments if you're watching live. And this episode is brought to you in part by patrons such as
I like how, Aziz, you dubbed the newer patrons as new pledges and older patrons as veterans. That's a good way. Let's start off with a couple of veterans. Envoy Shadowbinder from the Eastern Mountains and Lakes. That one sounds pretty mysterious.
Isn't that Enevi? I think it's Enevi.
Oh, maybe I said it wrong. Enevi. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Tree Girl of House Glade. We speak for the trees.
Nice.
You go, Tree Girl.
Yes.
And Lord George Stormsville, the Cunning, Lord of the Chiliad, and Warden of the East.
It's hard to say Lord George Stormsville. Lord George Stormsville. That's up there with Irish wristwatch.
Lord of Jorm's Storms. Yeah, never mind.
Yep. That's really hard.
A couple newer ones we've got here. Vanessa of Winterfell, Champion of Sansa. Yeah. Anyone who wants to be ex-Champion of Sansa, I'm going to say your name. I'm going to give you some credit.
You get Sean's eye that way.
Yeah. Narcosis, Wet Star Dane. Motto, a dry sword is a dull sword.
Nice. I think Narcosis has been around. Had been there and came back. That name's very familiar. I like that one a lot. Narcosis Dane. That's cool. Wet Star.
One last one. Another mouthful here. Stives the White, Captain of the Hopeful Patriots, a band of exile knights. Motto, the world ends when hope dies.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I hope hope doesn't die then, because I would like the world to continue. You can find all these Patreon names at historyofwesteros.com, along with everything else we mentioned throughout this episode. Anytime we bring up Patreons or links or any sort of thing that has to do with interacting with us or linking to our things, historyofwesteros.com should have it all. And at the end of this
not
episode,
only can you find those Patreon names, you could get your own Patreon name.
Good, true. Good, true. Good said. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll mention episodes at the end of this one that relate to this one to keep you immersed if you want to stay in Westeros. And we'll also kick it off with a trivia question, the answer of which is also at the end of this episode. And as we've been doing lately, the new pattern with the trivia questions is the answer can be found within the episode. Who gave Princess Maria of Dorne her nickname, the Yellow Toad? Who dubbed her the Yellow Toad? Our first section is called Open Gates at Oldtown, and we'll start it off with a quote.
The greatest city in all of Westeros, Oldtown was ringed about with massive walls and ruled by the Hightowers of the Hightower, the oldest, richest, and most powerful of the noble houses of the Reach. Oldtown was also the center of the faith. There dwelt the High Septon, father of the faithful, the voice of the new gods on earth, who commanded the obedience of millions of devout throughout the realms, save in the north, where the old gods still held sway, and the blades of the faith militant, the fighting order the small folk called the Stars and Swords. Yet, when Aegon Targaryen and his hosts approached Oldtown, they found the city gates open and Lord Hightower waiting to make his submission.
This is something that's a slightly puzzling that we've talked about, and it affects the timing. Maybe not puzzling, but curious or interesting or worth discussing. And that by that, I mean that Aegon didn't know until he got there that they had surrendered, apparently. Maybe he probably had some scouts go ahead, and they're like, they came back like, the doors are just open. Like, I don't think they're going to try to fight you. It might be a trick, but I don't think that's a very good trick, just leaving your doors open. I'm like, it's like, seems pretty genuine, right? It seems pretty sincere. So it would have been really interesting to know at what point did they learn that, yeah, they're not going to fight you. They may have already known, they've already suspected it because, well, if they were planning on fighting, why not join forces with their overlord at the field of fire? Why wait and try for a second try, especially after the first one was such a complete failure? So that doesn't really make much sense, does it? So Aegon was probably at least suspecting that they were going to concede, or that they already would. It may have been odd that they didn't send an envoy out ahead to announce this, but maybe that's also just how the history is recorded and isn't exactly how it happened. And I don't blame them either. I mean, I would have knelt too. I would have knelt fast, but no one knelt harder than Oldtown. I mean, they knelt big. They planned ahead. They had a whole cover story as to why they were going to kneel. The gods told them to. Like, they were very prepared. This was not a, should we kneel? Okay, yeah, we better kneel or else. No, this was very planned, preordained. Like, ordained is a funny word to use here because this was preordained. Like, the moment Aegon sent out his letters, apparently this prophecy came to the High Septon, or he started praying over it, and 7 days later, etc. So they had decided to bend the knee, apparently all the way back when before the Crown Lands were even settled. But they were also prepared, I suppose, to change their minds if Aegon just died during the conquest, which is maybe why they never said anything. Is that how you read it, Sean? Like, they were just they were leaving their doors open in more ways than one.
Yeah. I hadn't considered why. It did seem to me like, for multiple reasons, that they should kneel. Like, not only does it seem like they just couldn't beat them, and they have a lot to lose. Like, their castle and their people and their resources all getting burned by a dragon would be, not that it wasn't awful for Harrenhal to get built, but Harrenhal didn't have the history to it that Oldtown has.
Good point. Yeah,
and now Aegon has more forces than before after conquering those foes. Now there's extra people with them to come attack. There's all kinds of reasons. And I also do feel like their prophecy, here and there, maybe some people genuinely believed it, but it's a pretty easy thing to believe. God told me to do the right thing. Well, I think it's going to do the right thing anyway. But
God told me if I jump off this building, I will die. Like, oh yeah, did God tell you that, or science? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I won't jump off the building, whatever the reason is, whatever justification you need. But
all three agree.
The idea they didn't send someone out ahead of time to announce that is interesting. And again, maybe they did, but maybe it makes for less interesting of a story, right? Maybe it's more symbolic for Aegon to show up and her doors were open, rather than the middleman story of some envoy. Or maybe they even tried, but the envoy couldn't get there. Or maybe they had instructions only talk to Aegon, but they weren't allowed to talk to. I can see other behind the scenes minutia that isn't as interesting as important for the story.
Yeah, and we've seen this before throughout Fire and Blood and other parts of the history where it seems like, is that really what happened, or is that just a way to kind of make it look nice afterwards? And we're not saying like, is George fooling us here? No, I mean, like, did George write the history in a way so that it shows how the in-world historians would have done things that real-world historians tend to do? It's something that we've come back to many times, of course, but this is an important spot to remind ourselves of that, because just as, say, for example, the death of Argilac the Arrogant, like, was it really just a one-on-one duel where they each wounded each other once and all very story? But that's why it's written that way. The story resonates. That's what they want people to believe, because it keeps them in place or makes them believe something that they think is important to upholding their authority. Or the story of Aegon, the story of Orys Baratheon. This is something they have engineered, just like the story of Oldtown surrender is not a story of cowardice, right? It's like when Torrhen goes back north, a lot of his constituents will be like, well, that was cowardly. But we don't hear that about Oldtown, because it's like, oh, it's not us. The gods told us to surrender. Who says no to the gods? It's not cowardly when the gods tell you to do it. And it's just the same thing. It's not dirty to steal Argella Durrandon and make her your wife if you're noble about it, right? And it's like, well, you got to read between the lines. Of like, there's really no way to make that noble, but they're trying to make it sound noble because they want this new ruler who's taken over a dynasty that existed for 8,000 years. They want that to be a smooth transition, as smooth as possible, and making him look good is one of the best ways to do that. Making him look honorable.
Along the same lines, some of the constituents in the North at that time might have been grumbling, right? But it's not the way the story goes. It's not the way the Targaryens want it to be told. They don't want the story to be this coward in the North is now one of our wardens, right? They want it to be this wise man in the North did the right thing. That's the lesson and the legacy,
Aegon's not trying to shame them either. He doesn't want them to bend the knees in and look bad. Because they're now his like second and third and fourths in command. Like you don't want cowards in your authority structure and your hierarchy structure, or these people who look like cowards. If they are, you don't want them to look like that,
But you do want people that are wise and loyal,
and know when they can win and when they shouldn't win, when they can't, and to use common sense rather than pride, or think of their own people, think of the common folk beneath them and the responsibility you have towards them. So, and everything that happened throughout the war, they decided they were going to bend the knee. Maybe they didn't tell anybody, but everything they saw throughout the war just confirmed that their decision was correct, or that their command from above was correct. Like, yep, the gods were right about that one. And as you pointed out, Sean, and it just got worse. Like now Aegon's army is larger. Like the time to stand up to them has passed. Like it's harder now than it was. And Nina points as well. The Hightowers had a lot to lose. They had more to lose than a lot of these others. Oldtown is the biggest city in the region. Of course, that event or in the realm. Eventually that changes. But again, we got to remind ourselves King's Landing is not bigger than Oldtown at this point. It's barely started at this point.
Say it had been the second biggest. Well, yeah, that's still a lot to lose, right?
Yeah, you're right. Like you're right. That's almost an irrelevant point. Like whether it's first, second, third, it's huge. It's really important, and that's what matters, not exactly how large it is compared to the others. And the faith of the Citadel, like it's not just the city; it's the heart of religion in the entire country. Like, what happens if they play it stubbornly? What if they play it like Argilac or something like that, and decide to go down swinging? Well, at the end of all that, you might have no more Great Sept in Oldtown. It might have been destroyed, or the High Septon has been killed, or just really bad things that make it hard for everyone to get along afterwards. Like you don't want to, it's the same thing. You don't want to cause that bad blood that lingers for generations. You want to try to minimize that. That's why if you're going to take on a family, you wipe them out entirely. Don't let any of them survive so they can come get revenge later, like Harren the Black's family, or maybe even the Gardeners, and maybe a few other lesser examples. But that's just one way to keep peace in a realm, is to eliminate all those who would otherwise disturb that peace. It's not always just, but it is effective.
To keep peace in a realm where the leaders are chosen randomly by the oldest born son. Like that's
it's already
that's the random
system.
way you're choosing your leaders. Yeah.
Of course, they think it's a great system. They think, of course, well, why would you do it any other way? Well, it's like, why? Of course, that's the best system. Just because it has problems doesn't mean there's anything better. Well, of course, that's how we look at a lot of our systems. And it's like, what could be better? It sucks, but what could be better? Well, maybe there are better things. Anyway, so. And this is, we say it's, and we talked about this from the Hightower perspective, and we covered this in the Under the Dragons episode. We have no way of knowing how sincere they were. They may have been completely sincere. They may have truly believed the gods told them this. Or maybe the High Septon did, and Lord Manfred Hightower went along with it. Or maybe the other way around. The High Septon's the one who's a little bit of a politician, but makes all the pious noises, and Lord Manfred Hightower was the one that actually believed and was like, that's that. God said so. It's done, so there's no way to be sure, but it's really interesting to think about, because it's probably not simple. It's probably not, oh, he's just super devout and not political at all, or he's super political and not devout at all. It's probably somewhere in between.
It's also probably not just him, right?
Yeah.
It's him and the Septon, and the other members of their family and the other, I don't know what subseptums would be called, of cardinals or bishops or whatever. And there's probably like some equivalent of like a maester and a master coin. There's probably a lot of people getting together trying to figure out how to manage this, right?
Yeah.
And among those people, there's probably a mix of people who were like, we should stand up and fight. We should not sacrifice our people to dragons. What do the gods want us to do? And all those people will be so easily placated by saying, God told us. Like the political people, like, sure, that's a good story. Right. Yeah. The wise people, like, if that story works, let's do it. The devout people will obviously go along with it. So
I was really mad that he surrendered until I found out that God said so. Then it was cool. I'm like, oh, okay, I get it now. Yeah. And that's a great point Nina makes here too, which is, how do you look at an undefeated, basically unstoppable rolling force here of Aegon and the dragons? How do you look at that and say this isn't ordained? You know, it's hard to argue that the warrior isn't behind Aegon when he just beats everybody that worships the warrior more directly, and he does worship the warrior now at this point. So yeah, how do you ignore that? The gods, you either have to say the gods have chosen this, or you have to say the gods don't want this, but they're losing. You know, like, how do you frame that? It's difficult when you live in a world when your beliefs exist because you think God's made it this way. So if the gods made it this way, then you have to look at what's happening and say, well, the gods made it this way. I guess this is how it is. That Aegon is just steamrolling everyone. That must be what the gods want. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't believe the gods are in charge and then also believe the gods don't want this. You can believe they're testing you. You can always like do that sort of thing, but you don't have to believe. That's not the only choice you have. You know, you can also say,
I don't want to create too much of a tangent, but plenty of people do that.
Oh yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely. But people that have a lot to lose tend not to.
Yeah.
Like the Hightowers, right? They're like, well, let's come up with a reason that fits this worldview, but also gets us what we want, or keeps us from losing. You know. So
keeps us from dying and all our people dying. Yeah.
Which I get. Like, I think that's a fine time to tell a few lies if you're going to save a bunch of lives. Yes, I don't think honesty trumps keep survival. You know what I mean? Like, there's something to be said for honor and honesty, but not at the cost of just, you know, people dying, especially other people who aren't you. Like, that's
right. Yeah.
that's even worse. So anyway, whatever was actually in these people's hearts and minds, we can never know for sure. This is what actually happened. Quote.
Thus it was that no men from Oldtown burned on the field of fire, though the Hightowers were bannermen to the gardeners of Highgarden. And thus it was that Lord Manfred rode forth to greet Aegon the dragon as he approached, and to offer up his sword, his city, and his oath. Some say that Lord Hightower also offered up the hand of his youngest daughter, which Aegon declined politely, lest it offend his two queens.
We discussed that marriage offer at the time in the Under the Dragons episode, so refer back to that if you're curious about it. We also, I believe, discussed some of it at the beginning of the Conquest, beginning of the Fire and Blood reread, because there were several offers of this sort, and we covered them all at once rather than individually. So this is wise, like the Starks to bend, but a little more creative in their justification, but also possibly a huge parallel, right? It might be prophecy. There may have been some supernatural dreaming or at least influence here. And the part of the decision to kneel, whether it was stated or genuine, whether it was just a cover story for kneeling or something that actually happened or both, we don't know, but it's very possibly something that happened in both cases. And
just a quick tangent, just thinking about that. Yeah, just for example, let's say that this knowledge of the others coming one day that Aegon potentially saw, that Viserys saw, you know, that we seem to know that now. What if Torrhen Stark saw it also? Or some other earlier Stark saw it and was passing it down? And similarly, even though I think there might be an argument for like, tell everyone, make sure everyone knows and is on board and is ready for this prophecy, but maybe that you seem crazy or you get twisted interpretations or whatever. But I'm just saying that might be a reason Torrhen might have known he needed to surrender. He might have known this was coming, but he still needed to put on the right show, went down, talked to Aegon. That might have been part of the negotiations, you know. And I wonder too if that, right. And I wonder too if that could have been passed down through generations of Starks and might have died when Aerys burned the the Stark of Winterfell and his oldest son, Ned might have just not known the prophecy. Anyway, I'm wondering if it's possible other people in other places were aware of the same prophecy that Aegon might have been aware of.
Just
also.
like we have wondered about the tracking down through the years of Aegon's dream and who it went to and who learned about it, if there was a Stark prophecy, or if there must be a Stark in Winterfell isn't just a political necessity, but may have some supernatural wrapped into it, and maybe that part was forgotten. Some of the original reasoning behind it may have been forgotten. Yeah, that's possible. That's certainly
or kept
possible.
secret.
Or kept secret. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that seems entirely possible. So,
which, again, going back to all ideas of like what's in their hearts and minds when they're surrendering to Aegon, maybe there really was a prophecy, and some people really did believe it, or really even knew about it long ago,
And who knows what like vast knowledge is in the Hightower? We know what was written here, but maybe they framed it as the set will of the seven, but there could have been other prophecies or other writings that they referred to that may have worried them, but they didn't want to make that part of their cover story. Because like, we're not going to talk about some ancient text here. No one's going to care about that. That's just going to look cowardly or
right. We don't want to cloud it.
Confusing.
We don't want to confuse the issue.
Because we certainly know they have a lot of knowledge, a lot of vast stores of things that we couldn't possibly know, things that we couldn't dream of or guess at, both in their own tower and in the Citadel, perhaps, that they would have access to both. And so something interesting too, they were one of the decisions that they made, or one of the results of their decision staying out of the field of fire, was that they were not there for the restructuring of the Reach. Now they probably wouldn't have had any impact on that, to be fair. They probably wouldn't have changed anyone's mind. They probably wouldn't have stopped the Tyrells from being given Highgarden, and they may not have cared to interfere with that. But we're told that there was a lot of Reach houses upset with that decision. Hightower's not among them because they just weren't there for that. They weren't part of the decision. They weren't there to gripe. And maybe since they hadn't yet surrendered, they weren't going to make any waves until they're like, I'm going to kneel to you. But man, you shouldn't have given the Tyrells Highgarden, man. That was a bad call.
It could also be because they knew that was part of the prophecy. They knew that centuries into the future that they would still exist, be subject to the Tyrells, and need to team up with the Targaryens to fight the others. They might have known, like, oh, well, it's all happening. Look, it's in this thing,
If there was some kind of prophecy or dream of that regard that may have been referring to them marrying the dragon during the dance later, that would be interesting. Of course, that would lead to very bad things. But that's the uncertainty of prophecy, isn't it? Yeah. So it's certainly not the first time that they have bent the knee either, the High Towers. They were kings of their own way back in the day. They had to be subject to the Gardener kings, and there was a time when they weren't. But it was Lyman Hightower who, rather than lose it all, which is a similar decision, is like, look, you either have to bend the knee and accept a new overlord, or you might lose your tower, your city, and all that. You can still keep it, but under my authority. And just like Lyman Hightower, Manfred Hightower took the lesson and was like, yep, better to lose a little authority than to lose everything. So pretty pragmatic, pretty smart. And from the Targaryen side, as much as we looked at this from the Hightower side, the Targaryen side is pretty interesting. What would they think? Would they think this was would Aegon think this was would he see the politics and the gamesmanship behind this decision and be like, sure, they waited this long to tell me they were going to surrender, huh? I think he kind of understood what that meant, that they were waiting to see what happened, to give themselves the option of backing out, because they could have support. Like I said, not only did they not support their liege, they didn't support him. They could have brought their troops to the field of fire to fight for him if they had really been on his side from the beginning. So these are the kind of things I think he would think about. Now, ultimately, they bent the knee, and what he said was, bend the knee and I'll treat you well. So he's not going to go back on that, but he's also not going to fully be able to count on them as like hardcore loyalists, because he understands that they have a lot to protect. They have a lot of wealth that they're at stake to lose, that they could lose if they play it wrong. So he knows that they're always going to put that first. Even though he's their king, he can destroy them. He knows that's the thing that matters to them most, is their own wealth and power, which of course it matters to them most. So he's neither foolish, naive, or overly trusting about this, I think. I mean, Aegon doesn't come off as someone that would be overly swayed by such things. On the other hand, there is examples that we're going to get to of him being overconfident. As much as he projected extreme confidence because he really was that great in terms of dominance and power and having Balerion, there's some signs that maybe it went a little bit to his head. Maybe he thought, okay, I've proved my point. No one's going to stand up to me now. Who would possibly fight me now? I've dominated everyone and conquered almost the entire continent. Well, there were some, but he may have taken some of their surrender for granted, which we're going to be seeing here throughout the rest of this episode. So when the Hightowers didn't go hard for the Tyrells, for the Gardeners, why would Aegon expect them to go hard for him? So he knows what he has. He was like, okay, I can count on them to run this city. I can count on them to send me taxes. But if it comes down to a big war, I don't think I can count on them. And he'd be right about that. And the loyalty of Oldtown is going to become an ongoing back and forth, not just for Aegon. It's not really going to be a problem for Aegon, but for future Targaryen kings. There's going to be a lot of work put in to make sure Oldtown is in the fold. And then eventually it'll be too much in the fold when they marry into House Targaryen, but that's quite a ways away still. But all that builds, that ball started rolling when Oldtown surrendered without a fight, I think. Positioning itself as a piece of power that you can't quite grab onto. If you grab it too tightly, it will be gone. If you don't hold on to it tightly, it may help somebody else or help one of your enemies. And I think marrying into them was holding it too tightly, quite possibly. Still, he was ultimately pleased that he didn't have to destroy them or do any severe damage or unleash Balerion. It's a best case scenario for the most part. The High Septon effectively taking his side, was a massive windfall. Here's how it went after that. Quote,
3 days later, in the starry sept, his high holiness himself anointed Aegon with the 7 oils, placed a crown upon his head, and proclaimed him Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, lord of the 7 kingdoms, and protector of the realm. 7 kingdoms was the style used, though Dorne had not submitted, nor would it, for more than a century to come. Only a handful of lords had been present for Aegon's first coronation at the mouth of the Blackwater, but hundreds were on hand to witness his second, and tens of thousands cheered him afterward in the streets of Oldtown as he rode through the city on Balerion's back.
This is the same group of lords that had followed him to confront King Torrin, the ones that had submitted after the Field of Fire, with a few river lords mixed in from prior to that, and then a few other Reach lords who probably weren't on the Field of Fire, who decided it was finally time to submit. Better now than later. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. But picture Balerion going through the streets. We've got art of this. It's pretty incredible. Wowing the crowds. And as it says, the crowds would be enormous. Hundreds of people at the coronation itself, and then thousands, tens of thousands afterwards. And picture it. It's the spectacle of a dragon is worth it alone. Like, if I lived in that world and there's a chance to see Balerion, I would totally go do it. It's just a parade scenario. Obviously, I wouldn't go to the Field of Fire. I wouldn't go to the battlefield. But if I knew it was just, hanging out, of course I would go. And I think most of you would too. You'd want to see what that thing looked like. And you would see that the rumors were real. It wasn't exaggerated. And holy crap, that dragon really is as big as they say. I can understand why people bent the knee. I can understand how the Field of Fire was so one-sided. I can understand why Harrenhal was burnt. And all these people will remember it. And it's not just the dragon, the sighting of the dragon. It's a momentous day in the history of Westeros. The biggest governmental shift, the biggest cultural shift since the Pact or the Long Night in a single day. I mean, the Andals was a big thing, but that was a very gradual thing. The Andals coming was more than 1,000 years of waves and slow change, whereas this was a single day or a few days, or however you want to frame it. It doesn't really compare to a gradual migration. So I think I frame it more like that, like the Pact or the Long Night, something like that. So what was the average? What was the common view of this? Were people fleeing the city in advance of Aegon's arrival, or were they worried? What was the rumor mill like? I think eventually people figured out that that he's not coming to attack, and that's why the crowds were so big. So clearly people weren't that scared. But I feel like for a while before people knew there was going to be a surrender, maybe I don't know if the common folk knew that Manfred and the High Septon were planning on opening the doors. And we can say that because they were probably waiting to make sure it would happen. They hadn't fully committed to surrender, or else they would have told him ahead of time. So there would have been quite a lot of consternation, or like, what's going to happen? Is he going to come and destroy us like he destroyed Harrenhal? Once the fear passed and the people saw, okay, well, he's not doing that, the coronation happens, then I think that enables so many people to show up and watch him in the streets and then talk about that for literally generations. People who saw Balerion that day, they were there for the coronation, for one of the biggest days in the history of Westeros, whether they were in that room when he was crowned or just saw him on the streets afterwards. That's something you tell your kids tell those kids, tell their kids. They were there for that. I mean, it would be like being there for, I don't know, like the US is this roughly similar age to the Iron Throne's age. It's a little younger, but if you were there for the Declaration of Independence or had during the Revolutionary War and lived through that would be pretty huge. Your family would be proud of having had a representative there during that time, or whatever. If you're not from America, obviously you can have probably a similar event you can imagine in your country's history that's similarly momentous.
It's not as fantastic, but George Washington being coronated as the first president,
Yeah, it's very similar. Like, you're establishing a new system. Like, he's the first president of the, like, that's not as powerful as a king, but it's the first of a new system of government, the first to sit the Iron Throne, the first to rule the entire country. That's a huge deal. Yeah, well, not the entire country, but most of it. Most of it. Still a new political designation, a new level of authority that hadn't existed before. It's very significant, and that makes it memorable and important to be a part of, even if you're just in the crowd, Like, you could just, even if you're in the crowd for Game 7 of a memorable sports series, like, that's you tell your kids about that probably if they gave a crap about that sport. But like, just being there, being witnessed, really does mean something, right? It's I was there, I saw it. Yeah,
I think of one. I would probably tell folks. I guess it's we were there when George read Forsaken.
That's a good one for us.
Actually,
Yeah.
in our case,
we don't have any.
Our Game 7 of the sports.
That was our Game 7. Yeah, the Forsaken chapter.
I don't even know. If you say Game 7, I'm like, I don't know what sport you're talking about.
Lots of sports. Not football, not soccer, but basketball.
Multiple
baseball,
sports have a significant
hockey,
Game
maybe.
7.
Hockey.
Okay. Yeah. And or we went to the premiere of House of the Dragon at George's Theater too. That's not quite as cool as the Forsaken chapter, but
I don't think I don't know that would necessarily be told to children, but I would tell them the other ones.
Yeah, you're right. We also don't have any children to tell them to, but
I told the cats.
we told our cats. Yes, they're very proud of us. Yeah, and you mentioned, Sean, if someone had wanted to like assassinate Aegon, there were chances. There were not just here, but there were chances. Yeah, it's this. And other chances for the other.
Parading through the streets too. Like this. I wonder what kind of security there was. How confident was Aegon? How big were the crowds? That art we showed. One person in that crowd with a crossbow, one guard who didn't like this new thing. Who maybe. But I can also imagine everyone being in such awe. Like, I went through a little bit of like, what if it did? What if someone did? Some militant, some Faith of the Seven, some person who is still loyal to whatever, took it on themselves, without even any kind of organization or some plotting that could have happened. But it's just one person decided, I'm going to be the one to kill the Dragon Lord. Ooh, shot him with a crossbow.
I think that would
what
be
happens? Balerion unleashed the fire
from the grassy knoll.
They wouldn't do it. See, that's why I from a grassy knoll. That's hilarious. But no, that's why I think they wouldn't do it. Sean, is that if you shoot Balerion, even if you manage to kill him, he probably unleashes fire and devastation to everyone around you. And if you're doing this, you're probably doing it because you're trying to stop
This
further
might be a
deaths.
crazy person, though.
Yeah, it
so,
might be
you
crazy
know.
Right,
person,
that was
but I
my
just-
thought. Where you just have one
Yeah.
unstable person that
Yeah, it
decides.
just does just take one
Yeah.
unstable person, but the stable people who you might be like, well, why didn't they take their shot? Because this is, as even a stable person could like weigh the pros and
Yeah.
cons. I think they
And
would
just
weigh the
not
pros
think
and
about it
cons
properly.
and realize the cons were too much compared to the
Yeah.
pros of you kill them, but you also kill half the city or something like that. It's not worth it, and that's why there was no unstable person that was willing to do it. Ultimately, I think.
Also,
Yeah.
maybe it's not that easy to get a crossbow or be a good shot, or
You might have had Manfred Hightower or the High Septon or both, or the Warrior's Son just very wary of exactly such a thing happening and being watchful for it. They might be like, yeah, we can't allow one of the zealots to just like take a shot at Aegon. They probably won't even hit him, but what will he do to our city if he blames that on us? What if he like finds a reason to put that on us? They obviously were taking a lot of caution to avoid the destruction of their cities. They couldn't necessarily stop all the crazies, but they might be aware of it, and that would help.
And, for what it's worth, in relatively modern times, took a lot of presidents before someone killed John F. Kennedy. You know what I mean? Lots of presidents were paraded through the streets, and any person with a gun could have just walked up and shot him. And finally, someone did. Same with Abraham Lincoln, I guess. And even after Abraham Lincoln, they didn't stop going out in public after that.
Ronald Reagan got shot. Yeah, Jimmy Carter, right? Didn't Jimmy Carter got shot? Yeah, they both
not
got
Jimmy
shot.
Carter.
Not Jimmy Carter. Okay, Ronald Reagan got shot. Yeah, so there's been a lot of presidents that have been shot. Yeah. And a crossbow, it's harder to kill someone with a crossbow. I mean, Aegon was probably wearing his armor while going through the crowds,
Yeah.
So you got to have a really good shot. Anyway, so it's a lot to consider there. And in terms of number of eyes on it, we talked about how important it was for all those Northerners. We talked about why Corin brought so many of his armies, so they would be witnesses. Either they would be there to help him fight, or they would serve as witnesses afterwards. Either way, it worked. It's a good thing for him. But consider how many witnesses this would be compared to that. Way more. Way more. Because you got the armies there too. They've already seen it. But now you've got this entire population of Oldtown, plus all the people that came from the outskirts of the city who just for the spectacle, to see the coronation, the extra lords who weren't there before, and all the people they brought with them. So many witnesses. I don't think this is maybe one of the largest crowds that's ever gathered in the entire history of Westeros.
Not just that, but a crowd this size gathered at, I don't know, Winterfell or something, word won't spread as far and as fast. Oldtown is a center for commerce and education and et cetera.
There's just more people that live around there in general. Yeah. More people means
like everyone in the Citadel saw this and now teaches everyone else who comes through the Citadel from now on. And those people go out to other places to spread their knowledge. And
that's a fantastic
merchants
point.
And everything. So
the most capable historians would be there to record the moment, like lots of them. There's probably more accounts of this in the Citadel than there are of a lot of other things that wouldn't have taken place right in front of them.
Capable and connected.
Yeah. So this is also
with the sept. To everyone that comes to the sept to train or to worship, then goes back to their homes in other lands, brings this story with him.
Yes. So that's and Aegon was probably aware of that, or if he wasn't, people would have made him aware of that. It's like, hey, King, look at the power of spreading word here. And so this is when, speaking of, this is when conversations of a new capital started to come up. Now, Aegon had already decided. It seems like very likely he had already decided on King's Landing. And for multiple reasons, the biggest of which, he was already collecting swords for his throne. He wasn't going to build his throne somewhere other than his capital, right? That doesn't make any sense. Like, oh yeah, my capital's here, but my throne is hundreds of miles away. No, of course not. The capital and the throne are going to be in the same spot. So the fact that he's been sending swords to this place all along, ever since the first battle, meant that he had already decided. He just hadn't told people, or hadn't told many people, or word wasn't out. It wasn't important for him to spread that word. He may have had a reason for that. He may not have wanted people to know that. He may have wanted them to court their city and do things for him. And he may have liked that process. That may have been value to him for that. Because in doing so, they may have given him a good accounting of all the features of the city, so that it could be, like a presentation, like a PowerPoint presentation on why Oldtown should be the capital. It's like, I want them to make this presentation so that they tell me everything there is to know, even though I have no intention of choosing it. I still want to know everything about the city, things that they might have otherwise kept from me. Factors and tax revenues and things like that they might have kept hidden.
Defensive capabilities.
Yeah, defensive capabilities. Sure. Number of troops. Just count. Yeah, how many spears and bows and things you have. Those those things might have been told anyway. But if it's different from then he's forcing you to tell versus you're in a position where you're pitching it to him.
Yeah.
So you're more likely to exaggerate than hold back in one scenario versus the other. And these are the kind of power games that Aegon would maybe and probably be aware of. It's like, well, it's all about how you frame it. If I present myself, are you selling this to me or am I demanding it of you? If you're selling it to me, then I'm going to get a different kind of answer than if I'm demanding it from you. So he knew all along that King's Landing was going to be the site. Now, what we can only guess at is why he waited. And I just gave you one possible reason, but that's just a pure guesswork. And the other would be, well, what were they doing to guess at this? And why did he wait for now? And what were people's reactions to him declaring King's Landing? Were there immediate like investment in the new city where like the Hightowers and the Lannisters immediately like rushing to invest in shops and build houses and mansions there? Or there'd be business opportunities like crazy. This is the kind of thing that George doesn't write about a lot, but it had to have been happening. And it would be real interesting, like a big new city being built in a really important location right next to the new capital where all sorts of trade and opportunity is clearly going to be happening. How did the realm react to this? Who got their finger into that pie? Who ignored it? Who missed the opportunity? I mean, we don't hear today about like the Lannisters having like big amounts of property in King's Landing or the Hightower. So quite possibly they were not allowed to do much, or they didn't take the opportunity, or I don't know. But this is a kind of a more than a gray area. It's a dark gray area. I really have very little idea. But it had to be happening. These are the kind of things that happen whether it gets written about or not. Economic development, rich people trying to get richer. That's always happening 24/7. The way the world works, even when it's a fantasy world. So the second real coronation, if we go back to that briefly, it's the change in how the dates are reckoned. So whenever we look at dates, for a while there, before Fire and Blood and before the World of Ice and Fire, there was a little discrepancy, not a discrepancy, but confusion as to wait, did the conquest start when the conquest started or when it ended? Like, when do you start? Because that's like a year. When is year one start? When everyone bent the knee the first time, the second time? Or so yes, the second time is the answer. This is when the reign begins officially, like the calendar is marked from this point. So that makes it more official than the first kneeling. And that makes more sense too. It's the High Septon and the gods and way more, all the lords, whereas before it was just his own people, hardly anyone witnessed. So it makes sense to have a big show, make a big spectacle of it all. And let's look at what he called himself, right? King of Westeros, not just that. He was king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. Okay, so he had pretty much subjugated the Andals and the First Men mostly, but he hadn't. I don't know that a single Rhoynar had bent the knee at this point. They all lived in Dorne, other than a few random people that, live elsewhere. But so maybe a few technically had bent the knee, but very few. Certainly not any large group. That's a very important distinction. He was claiming, this is where I'm talking about the overconfidence and maybe even a little arrogance. He's claiming dominion over people he had not only not conquered, he hadn't even had FaceTime with or diplomacy with yet. He's called himself Lord of the Iron Isles and of the Three Sisters and of Dorne, who haven't bent the knee at all. And Rhaenys was sent to go talk to them, but it's unclear whether she had actually had a meeting with anyone yet by this point. So Aegon may have been calling himself King of Dorne or Lord of the Rhoynar and all these different titles without a single Dornish representative having said a word about it yet, which is like, yeah, that's you're trying not to insult people. That's pretty insulting. He's like, yeah, I'm your king now, and I haven't even set foot in your country.
In his defense, he didn't know that they weren't bending the knee either, right?
Yeah,
it's not like he knew they were standing up to him and he was disregarding it. And I mean, we just talked about, he showed up at Oldtown and their doors were open. Like the precedent was established. He won battle after battle. He proved his point. How can anyone beat me? The fact that it's so hard to beat me means people are preemptively surrendering. it's a reasonable, you know, if you're winning the Super Bowl 47-12 or whatever, and the reporter comes up in the sideline and there's still 7 minutes in the game, but you're like, yeah, we won the Super Bowl. You know, it's 47-12. It's a reasonable thing to think, you know, like,
Yeah,
sure,
27-0.
they could come back, I guess, but yeah. Crazy things can happen, but it's reasonable for him to not expect the crazy thing, you know. So.
Yeah. So the point is, though, maybe it wasn't crazy. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it's not crazy for Dorne to give up or to not submit. I'm not sure. That it's debatable.
With hindsight, it seems to be the case, you know.
Yeah, because clearly they didn't. He didn't beat them. They didn't. They're not going to submit for 190 more years, and it won't be due to violence. So he clearly miscalculated there, even if it wasn't crazy. He was wrong. He was wrong, but maybe not crazy. So there is also a little more to be said about it too. Like one of the other titles he's taken is the Shield of His People, Protector of the Realm. Well, there's still fighting going on, and there's still places that are in chaos that he's not going to address for quite a while. It's like, you call yourself Protector of the Realm while the realm is a portion of the realm is tearing itself apart, and you're not lifting a finger to do anything about it for a while. To be fair, again, he's got a lot to do. He can't be everywhere at once. So yeah, it's making apologies for a conqueror is a weird position to be in, but it's like Westeros did become a better place to live after. So I think it seems that way. So it's also like, well, yeah, it's not simple. The morality here is it's hard to put real world morality into it because it is even if you think of it as a real world. Just values and technology and history is also different.
Also, screw that portion of the realm.
I hate sand.
Well, I meant the Iron Islands.
Okay, I hate salt.
I hate the concept of salt wives. How about that?
Okay, that's good. That's good. So let's talk about the Unbowed. Here's a very brief quote to describe what we mean.
Though the wars of conquest were said to have ended when Sorry, let me say it again. Though the wars of conquest were said to have ended when Aegon was crowned and anointed by the High Septon in the Starry Sept of Oldtown, not all of Westeros had yet submitted to his rule.
That was kind of a funny accidental pronunciation there, Sean. You almost called it the Sorry Sept. What is the Sorry Sept of Oldtown? That is a Sorry Sept. Jeez. What a Sorry Sept. It's pathetic. So Aegon had work to do still, despite so many acclaiming him as their king, despite all those witnesses spreading the word, which he presumably and logically expected to solidify his rule even more. It wasn't enough. There were holdouts. Like very few of the people who bent the knee at Oldtown went to Dorne to tell the story. Very few witnesses, or if they did, it didn't move them over much. And there would be microcosms of this story. We've talked about it a few times with regard to the Starks, but there would have to be other versions of this on a smaller scale in the other regions too. There would be maybe a few in the Vale or in the West, or maybe even in the Stormlands, who were like, I am hesitant to accept this new order of things. It's been this way for so long, and they're not necessarily up in arms, but they're holding out. They're stubborn. They're refusing to do a few things, and there would need to be face time between some of these former kings and their still vassals who are no longer subject to a king, but to a high lord. And a lot of these little things would have to take place. And this is the kind of thing I'm thinking of when I'm thinking Aegon can't just rush off to Dorne or the Iron Islands. There's maybe some of these smaller scale things that don't make the history books because it never came to blood. The negotiations were tedious, but they did end up working out. So like, it's not very historical, but it's something that we can definitely read between the lines as likely happened. And I like to point these things out because, well, it's realistic. We're trying to fill out the world as much as possible, trying to make it feel realistic and breathable and breathing. And well, if you like role-playing campaigns, things like that, you try to just turn over every stone, look behind every door and see, what would be there and what realistic elements would take place. What are things that humans would do no matter what, What are some stimuli that we can reliably predict would be the responses for? So yes, the Three Sisters, the Iron Islands, and Dorne were the three big holdouts. But I'd like to guess that there were some more smaller scale ones. So 2 groups of islands, right? And the farthest kingdom to the south. And I think that's important because this geography plays a role here in both. They're more unique, they're more culturally distinct. Some of them have different, well, one of them has a different religion, and Dorne is culturally different. They treat women differently. There's different racial groups. Yeah, besides the geography and the separation of things like mountains and deserts that enforce certain cultural differences and keep people from meeting and talking and growing more similar over time.
The 3 sisters sort of had a different religion too, right? Weren't they at least sort of worshiping the old gods? I mean,
no, not really. I mean, yes and no.
No?
Like they have
Okay.
their older gods that are different than any other old gods. They worship the Lord of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies, which is sort of like
Oh,
the
okay.
drowned god and the storm god. And a lot of there's similarities between those. But that religion is gone. Whereas almost gone. Whereas the Iron Islands clearly still worship the drowned god and fear the storm god. So they're mostly worshippers of the 7 there. They have knighthood and all that stuff. They're similar
Okay.
to the Vale in that, because the Vale is what's ruled them for most of that time. But they do have more north in them than anywhere else in the Vale, I would guess, because not just because of proximity, but because of that cultural separation, that distinct microcosm that they are, and just frequent trade and with the North. And Northerners probably lived there too at some point, off and on. So that's important to note, the actual distinct differences, cultural significance, this and that, here and there, all that. Yeah, there's a lot of differences, and those things mean a lot. Like because think of it this way: if a king comes in and demands you surrender, and he has all the same values as you, it's a lot easier to bend the knee, especially when he's also stronger than you. But that's not the case for the Iron Islands, right? He doesn't have your values. He's in fact going to stop your values. He's going to tell you, no, you can't live this way anymore. Whereas the rest of Westeros, for the most part, gets to go on living the way they were before. The king in the north is the High Lord in the north, but he still gets to worship the same gods, eats the same foods, goes about his business the same way. The Ironborn are going to be told to change a lot about how they live. It's a cultural upheaval as well as a authoritative upheaval.
Finally.
Finally.
Be clear.
Yeah. For Dorne, it's similar. It's not a religious upheaval. They worship the 7, so they're not being told to change that. But it is still a place that values their independence more. Even under the Prince of Dorne, they're less beholden to their own ruler than, say, the High Towers were to the Gardeners, right? There already was less authority held by the Martells. They hadn't ruled for as long. Dorne wasn't united nearly as recently as the other regions. So there wasn't a long history of, oh, well, we've always followed the Martells. No, that only been the case for hundreds of years, not thousands. And there were some houses that, kind of like how there are even houses now that don't like the Tyrells being in charge. There are houses that in this time were still kind of like, I don't know about those Martells. I don't think they deserve to be on top, especially people like the Ironwoods and a few others who were similarly elite amongst other Dornish.
There were also, correct me if I'm wrong, but smaller populations that are more spread out.
Yes.
They're not as streamlined and connected from city to city, it's not as regimented a hierarchy leading up to the Martells. The Martells probably barely know or care what most of the people in Dorne are doing. They're technically in charge, but they don't have some lord going out. There's not as much interaction or connectivity between them, right?
Yes.
And that's probably kind of true for the North too, more so than the Reach, right?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Okay, let's take a little break here, and we'll come back and talk about the Iron Islands first and make our way over to Dorne. We probably won't have time for the 3 sisters, but all 3 of these situations begin now or have started a little while ago and last into the reign of Aegon. So none of these things are resolved quickly, especially Dorne. So it will be continuing forward with these threads until they're complete. That said, after this episode, we are taking a Fire and Blood break, not a episode break, but we will return to Fire and Blood content right at the end of the year or right before the end of the year. We're working on the schedule right now. It's a little bit subject to change, but as of now, the week before the end of the year is going to be when we get back to Fire and Blood, most likely. In the meantime, we'll be putting out more of our regular style episodes where y'all vote on a selection topics that we present, and they can be pretty much any topic from all over the fandom. And also we're going to be doing an episode on catching ourselves up on what's been going on with the TV shows. Just a kind of roundup of what's been a while since we talked about that, and want to get ourselves caught up and stay up to date on that. All right. I also want to bring up something that is a little outside of Game of Thrones. You know, it's hard to find good fantasy shows on TV. There are a lot of them, you know, start off good and kind of decline. It's not just fantasy shows, but a lot of TV shows go that way. It's more common for a show to start off well and get worse than the other way around, but it does happen. And sometimes it goes both ways. Sometimes it improves and then it goes back down. Who knows? All shows are different. There is no one size fits all for the history of television quality, right? One show that both falls into the fantasy bucket and also has improved from its first season, which is, as I said, a breath of fresh air. It's kind of rare that that happens. Is The Wheel of Time. I'm a fan of the Wheel of Time series. I've read the books a long time ago, so long ago that when watching the TV show, I kind of forgot some things every once in a while. I was surprised by things I should have known. I was like, oh yeah, I knew that. I should have known that from the book. But I had forgotten because it's been so long. So I do recommend the Wheel of Time TV show. You can get it on Amazon Prime. And season 2 was way better than season 1. It was a huge improvement. They focused more on characters. They focused more on conflict, events of the heart, rather than, well, chasing things around and monsters and battles, which can be fun, but it's not as fun as character conflict and character-driven stuff. To be fair, that's also a reflection of the books. The first book was kind of like that, and the second book was just better. So it makes sense the TV show would be like that. But if you're one of those people that gave Wheel of Time a chance, didn't really like it, maybe give it a second chance. You can find, again, you might be worth getting on Prime if you don't have it. So you can sign up for Prime on our website. And there's a lot of other benefits to Prime as well, besides that. So let us know if you enjoyed Wheel of Time or if you come back to it. You know, I like to mention other good fantasy shows that are out there, other good fantasy books from time to time. And since this one's currently in the zeitgeist and will be back for at least one more season, hopefully more, if the quality uptick continues, then it's a nice thing to have for your entertainment shelf.
You know, the wheel of time just keeps on turning.
Wheel of the time keeps on turning. Yeah.
I don't know. I can't remember if you said it, but signing up, you can sign up for Prime, like with the History of Westeros discount, right? Is that the...
Yeah. Well, there's not a Prime discount, but you get all these extra benefits. One of which is this, and we would get, you know, we do get a cut of any sign up, of course, but also you can use you also get a one free Twitch subscription, which some of y'all could use to watch our Twitch streams and subscribe there, because we do our Crusader Kings for a Song of Ice and Fire stream almost every Friday at 6 p.m. So shout out to that as well. Yeah, good stuff. It's very disappointing seeing the from like 5-6 years ago, we had a golden age of fantasy TV almost, and already feels like that was much longer ago. You know, with Game of Thrones season 8 being a downer for a lot of us, and some of these other shows that have come out since, like The Witcher started off great, and it really super disappointed in that, how that went. And yeah,
mixed emotions around the Rings of Power.
I wouldn't call that too mixed. It was pretty bad, but but I still watched it. I watched it as soon as it came out every week. So I can't say that I didn't enjoy it, but I was like, a lot of times I was like crinkling my face, like, what? Don't do that. Don't take the plot in that direction.
If you want to crinkle your face too, that's also an Amazon show, right?
Thanks to Kenny.
Amazon's got a lot of outside of fantasies. There's a lot of There's a lot of great shows on there.
Yeah, Vikings, and yeah, we'll come back and mention a few others in future weeks, because we've spent enough time on it today. But yeah, like I like to mention what's good that's out there, since it's in our wheelhouse, right? Shout out to Kenny from the chat for sending a super chat. Dancing sticker. Appreciate that. Dancing. Maybe that's for you, Sean.
My kind of sticker.
Dancing sticker for Dancing Sean. Yeah. All right. Back to the Iron Islands. That's right. Let's talk about them. This is, so like I said, we're not going to cover the entire scenario with the Iron Islands. This is just what's been happening while Aegon's conquering elsewhere, while after Harren's fall. Here's Theon's first chapter, which of course is the Clash of Kings. Quote.
Sorry, I got out of place here. This is the Drowned God, right?
Yes.
The Drowned God had made them to reave and rape, to carve out kingdoms and write their names in fire and blood and song. Aegon the dragon had destroyed the old way when he burned Black Heron, gave Heron's kingdom back to the weakling rivermen, and reduced the Iron Islands to an insignificant backwater of much greater realm. Yet, the old red tales were still told around the driftwood fires and smoky hearths all across the islands, even behind the high stones of Pike. Theon's father numbered among his titles the style of Lord Reaper, and the Greyjoy words boasted that we do not sow. It had been to bring back the old way more than 40. Doggone it. It had been to bring back the old way more for the Why can't I say this sentence? It had been to bring back the old way more than for the empty vanity of a crown that Lord Balon had staged his great rebellion.
Reduced, he says. So let's like reduce them to that. They kind of already were that. But at the time, for most of their history, it happened to be a blip in history that they were perhaps the most powerful kingdom at the time of Aegon's conquest. But for most of their existence, they were not. Going back really far, they were very significant because they were kind of unstoppable. They attacked wherever they wanted to, and very few people could stop them. So they sort of did have their run of the Western shores, and no one could really do anything about it. But that had fallen off long before what Theon is talking about here. So they had kind of made a resurgence and then fallen off again once they were beaten. So like a lot of Ironborn, even ones who weren't fully raised on the Iron Islands, they have misconceptions about the greatness of their own people. They kind of lie to themselves, kind of exaggerate their own glory to make themselves feel better or to be proud. I don't know why, but I mean, people do that. It's not strange to think of people pumping up their own culture and ignoring the bad parts, which is pretty hard to do with the Ironborn, to ignore the bad parts. You pretty much have to look at the bad parts as good parts.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you just don't think that they're bad.
Yeah, they think that's good. Yeah, so
you don't think it's bad until someone else is doing it to you.
Right. So the problem here is they descended into chaos because they didn't have a leader anymore. Yes, like a lot of these countries, right? They lost their leaders, but Aegon appointed someone else to take over immediately, or they took over immediately. Like Oris Baratheon took over the Stormlands right away. The Tyrells were given control of the Reach right away, like days after the Field of Fire. Immediately after Harrenhal was burned, Edmund Tully was given the Riverlands. Like that was like the same day or the 24 hours later or something. The Iron Isles, though, Harren taken out, all his sons taken out. I'll come back to that later. So the Iron Isles is tearing itself apart while Aegon is conquering the rest of the continent. Busy with the Field of Fire, busy with getting crowned in Oldtown, busy declaring himself king of places like the Iron Islands that he's not really being a king of, because how can you call yourself protector of the realm when you're allowing the state of affairs to happen? And he allowed it to happen for quite a while. To be fair, he may have thought it would take a lot to stop, and that requires a lot of gathering of military power and getting it all together and sailing it over there, and which is what happened eventually. But we're not covering that today because it, like I said, took a while. It wasn't even within a year.
You know, there's another angle I didn't think of till just now, but when you said, how can you call yourself protector of the realm? If he had named someone to be in charge of the Iron Islands, and then that person took a navy and attacked the West or attacked Dorne, you see it now, it would be kind of under Aegon that this is happening. Whereas if he doesn't name someone and they war against each other, they're not warring against someone else. He's almost is protecting the realm by getting them to it. Yeah, I
totally agree. He might have been planned. He may. I say he just let them be but that may have been intentional. You might be right. That might have been the part of the plan. Like, yeah, it's the best thing to do is let them weaken themselves, and then I'll come in. Then we'll bring the heavy hand down, make them stop after they've gone at it for a while. But if we attack them now, they may unite against the common foe, us, the one that's trying to come and take their religion away, to take the old way away. That's you can picture it. Like, they're coming to take the old way away. Well, let's all unite to stop that. Like, that is one of the few things that might get them to unite, is someone coming to take their gods away, or their way of life. Which
or even,
was true.
Again,
he was going to come do that.
Yeah. Or again, what I'm saying is, if they were united, even if they accepted Aegon as their ruler, they still, under their union, might have gone after one of the other 7 kingdoms, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
And now it's so, rather than Aegon stopping them from fighting each other, Aegon's got to stop them from fighting one of the other kingdoms that he's already got on his side, that's expecting this from. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's true.
They're distracted with each other and not attacking the rest of the 7 kingdoms, which is his way of protecting the rest of the 7 kingdoms, you know?
Yeah. So Theon does have a point, though. So even though he's exaggerating and gets some of the details a little mixed up, and maybe his chronology is a little bit off, he's still mostly right. Like, it isn't maybe blamed on Aegon. And it's fine to do it if you want to. I don't think it matters. Most of the regions under the Iron Throne, life improved there. But arguably the Iron Islands is separate, is not under that. It depends on who you are. I think, like, the fishermen of the Iron Islands, who I would care about them more anyway, because they're, innocents for the most part. Their lives may have gotten better. I'm not sure, but it definitely got worse for the people who follow the old way, which, good, good for them. It's good that they don't get to do that. Yeah, Nina writes that it's just the problem with the Ironborn system. It's incompatible with submitting to a king and being part of a greater realm. Their system is kill everyone who's not us. Everyone else is our wheat. We do not sow. We reap a harvest of humans. We take your harvest. You do the work for us. You can't have that. That's not compatible. That's not a neighborly attitude. It has to change for them to fit. So yeah. So, which is why it has to be approached differently, which is why it maybe has to be approached with a little more caution and or with a lot more strength, to make sure whatever you force them to do, they have to do it. Like, the force is strong enough to compel them. Because you're talking about zealots, not just talking about brave warriors. You're talking about zealots here. The drowned god is going to play a role here, as we'll see. And yeah, like, you can't just... That's an important distinction, too, when I'm talking about the fishermen versus the reavers. Like, the problem isn't the Ironborn necessarily. It's the old way. The old way is the problem. Like, the old way isn't in their DNA. It is in their cultural DNA because it's been around for so long. But it's not, like, literally in their bodies, Like, that's a thing that's like a real world way that racism is thrown around, is people act like the behavior of a group is some sort of like an inborn quality rather than a cultural behavior or a thing that's taught or an effect of being downtrodden or spoiled or anywhere in between. But a fantasy world gives us an exception, potential exception, the kind of thing that people say in the real world when they're being ridiculous, but they actually believe it. Like, in other words, like calling another race like the devil, or calling another culture the devil. Like, no, they've got the devil in them. Now here, this might actually be true. It's like, in a fantasy world, that kind of racism actually might fly because the Ironborn might actually have Deep One's DNA in them. Right? So it's like, because if that's the true, then okay, fine. Sink the whole island. Like, just get rid of them all. That's fine. Okay. We have to, there's no rehabilitating the old ones. But
there is a maybe an argument too that it's just that it is a systemic thing, that since the Iron Islands have limited resources, they don't have the option of fields of wheat, right? So possibly you could argue that attacking, pillaging other areas is a natural thing to occur. I still don't think it justifies it, but we've seen it in the real world, right? Like, that's part of the reason the Vikings came down to England and Europe or whatever. They didn't have enough food for all the people up there. They needed more land for farms. It's not so much that they wanted to go conquer and pillage. They just needed more land to not starve.
Well, some of them did. Some of them
people on that land already, so they conquered and pillaged. But
yeah. So yeah, you're right. Like, again, we don't want to. You can't put them all into a single bucket. There's a lot of different types of people involved here. Some that just wanted to rape and pillage, and there's no rehabilitating that. But some of them would be open to making a life a different way, like Asha. Even a Greyjoy, like Asha's like, why are we doing this? Let's just go buy a load of goods and go to the other side of the world, trade that, and come back with their goods, and we'll make a ton. Like, a lot of Ironborn could do that instead of raping and pillaging, and there's even arguably more money in the trade.
Less danger,
yeah, or at least similar danger. Like, traveling all the way to the other side of the world is probably pretty dangerous, but that shouldn't be a problem if you're willing to make a living a dangerous way with the axe and sword. And then this is a different sort of danger. So yeah, I do see a path forward for the Ironborn that isn't raping and pillaging, and so did Asha. She sees that as well. Like, it's hard to convince her countrymen of that, but us readers can see that and be like, I think that makes sense. There's, like, she pointed out how there's large parts of the north that no one lives, that have food. Like, people could live there. Like, you could build farms and hovels here. There's good hunting grounds here. There's good fishing here. There's good trees so there is, with the right vision and right peace and sense of unity, you could have that. Those things did not happen under Aegon or anyone. But
don't blame Aegon.
in that area, those things like that did happen elsewhere in the realm. But yeah, at no point even under Jaehaerys, when building was at its peak, there's never been a lot of, like, public works projects or building projects. It's always been, Jaehaerys was like one of the very few exceptions, and there's just not a lot of that. So the Iron Islands, you can't really blame, even though Aegon, it's sort of his job as protector of the realm to come in and stop them from killing each other or to stop them from killing their neighbors. The fact that they went at each other so hard isn't his fault, right? It probably would have happened in some degree anyway. So I'm not sure he's showing a disdain for them rather than just making them a low priority / understanding how hard this job is going to be to fix the Iron Islands or to keep them in line. So there's a lot of different factors to consider here. Now, and that's not the first time this is going to happen either. Consider 210, 20 years later, when Dagon Greyjoy emerges and just starts attacking the west and the north and doing his thing, and Bloodraven's a little too concerned about the possibility of another Blackfire invasion to send the ships over there. And it's the same thing. It's kind of like he ignores the problem. Well, doesn't ignore the problem. He considers it a low priority for a while and maybe hopes it takes care of itself, and never does. And he has to go over and deal with it. Now, I don't think Aegon expected this to take care of itself entirely, but it's similar in that he had to maybe rethink his priorities eventually because this kept going. One reason he might have not thought this would happen, he may have been surprised at how much the Iron Isles tore itself apart. Because they aren't supposed to do that. They have that religious prohibition. We'll come back to that in a minute, but let's not forget, the old way says Ironborn are not supposed to fight Ironborn. It's like a religious cultural thing that you're supposed to turn your violence outward on other peoples. Like, everyone else is our wheat, not each other. Obviously, like every cultural taboo across a huge amount of time, it gets broken. But this is perhaps one of the most spectacular, long, extended times of that happening, of it being broken for quite a while. So the ruling dynasty just up and vanished. Huge power vacuum, structural and power. There's no dynasty and no, like the Horror Dynasty had kind of started ignoring the Iron Isles anyway. They were more focused on their land-based projects, on Harrenhal and ruling the Riverlands. So they'd already kind of been turned into a backwater. That's something Theon forgets when he's talking about turning it into a backwater. Your own king had started doing that to it. It just got worse when that king died. And so this is, of course, in a power vacuum, is going to be people that step forward to try to fill that vacuum. For example, there were claims to be made, and here's the first one. Quote,
House Horror had ruled the Iron Men for long centuries, only to be extinguished in a single night when Aegon unleashed Balerian's fires on Harrenhal. Though Harren the Black and his sons perished in those flames, Corin Volmark of Harlow, whose grandmother had been a younger sister of Harren's grandsire, declared himself the rightful heir, quote, of the Black line, and assumed the kingship. Not all Ironborn accepted this claim, however.
Yeah, if they had, it might have just gone peacefully, and they may have bent the knee to Aegon on their own, and that would be that. And Aegon would be like, "Yep, I don't have to do anything." That may have been something he hoped for. He may not have expected it to be likely, but it was certainly on the table as a possibility. But Corin Volmark was unable to unite the Ironborn. By the way, this is the only other Corin we've ever heard of besides Corin Halfhand. I believe I heard the theory from Nina that there's a chance that Corin Halfhand is Ironborn. Not what you would expect necessarily, but absolutely possible. Now, generally speaking, if someone's claim to a throne or a seat or whatever, a title, it causes you to scrunch up your face calculating it. Like, wait, grandmother had been a younger sister of Heron's grandsire. Wait, what is that? If it causes you to like feel like you're doing math, it's probably a bit specious. It probably isn't a very strong claim in terms of blood. However, it tells you nothing in terms of how strong the claim is vis-a-vis military strength or political power, because you can have a very thin claim backed by a lot of military strength. This appears to be neither. It didn't have a lot of political power or military strength, and it was kind of thin in terms of blood. But Nina points out this is also pretty common. You know, sometimes there's just it may be a thin claim, but that thin claim may be the strongest. Like thin doesn't mean there's anything thicker. So, like Henry VII of England, right? He was the great-great-great-grandson of King Edward III through the legitimized female line. And then when the 1701 Act of Settlement acknowledged Electress Sophia of Hanover as heiress to the British crown, there were more than 30 people that probably had a stronger claim. Now, because they were all Catholic, Queen Anne turned to the youngest daughter of her grandfather's sister. Shea, do you remember that TV show? What was it called? The one where the two heirs, the two heirs from Almost Royal, where the beginning of every episode, it said, Poppy and Georgie are 51st and 52nd to the line of the British throne. The next episode would be Poppy and Georgie are 67th and 68th. The next episode, Poppy and Georgie are 33rd and 34th. And they would just change every time. They would just make up a new number every time for it. And this is kind of that. Like, I'm like, this is Corin Volmark. I don't know if his claim might have been the best, but that doesn't mean it was good, right? That the argument works both ways. It might be the best claim, but that doesn't mean it's a good claim. But who else is there? There's no one. It's a problem when someone's claiming the throne and no one has a strong claim. So it only comes down to military and political power if no one has a strong blood claim.
Religious power.
Right, which is where I'm going. That's where religious power is going to come up huge here because of the power vacuum of political and military power is filled by religious power. So while Aegon is off receiving the blessing of the most important religious figure in Westeros, meaning the High Septon, a less important religious figure to Westeros as a whole, but the most important religious figure in the Iron Islands was emerging, or I guess he was becoming the most important at this time. His name was Lodos. And we'll see him in a second here. In addition to showing some contempt for the Isles via making them a low priority, right, which is where we come back to reminding ourselves that Aegon accepted the Seven. He took on a new religion, but it wasn't the religion of the Iron Isles. So they're seeing him switch religions, and they're still on the outside of all that. So the power of religion, again, this is pretty realistic, I think. You have a lot of back and forth, you have power vacuum, you have people killing each other, religion floods the void. And then religion in the Iron Isles is already extremely powerful. The priests of the drowned god wield more power than perhaps the priests of almost any other religion around the world. Maybe the red priests are an exception, but I don't even know about that. If it's the case, it's partly because they're so numerous, but man, the drowned priests have a lot of power. Let's hear about that quote.
On Old Wick, under the bones of Naga the Sea Dragon, the priests of the drowned god placed a driftwood crown on the head of one of their own, the barefoot holy man Lodos, who proclaimed himself the living son of the drowned god and was said to be able to work miracles. Other claimants arose on Great Wick, Pike, and Orkmont, and for more than a year their adherents battled one another on land and sea. It was said that the waters between the islands were so choked with corpses that krakens appeared by the hundreds, drawn by the blood. Can I say real quick, though?
Yeah.
every time I say the words driftwood crown, I hear we had a blooper one time where I think it was Aziz who said it. He said the driftwood clown.
I
And
did.
I was like trying my hardest as I said it. I was like, the driftwood crown.
The clip, unfortunately we lost this clip. I had a collection of clips of goofs, mostly my own, and the hard drive that was on died, so we lost all those comedy clips. And I immediately just busted out laughing. I just like heard myself say driftwood clown, and then just stopped, stunned at the humor that I had accidentally uttered. So this is a great quote. It brings in a lot of fantasy elements, but also real world, like religious traditions, where some powerful person declares themselves the son of a god, whether it's Jesus or any number of people before him or after him, declaring themselves the son of Egyptian gods or of Phoenician gods, or just you name it. People like Achilles is a descendant of Zeus and Thetis, and all, like Alexander the Great claims to be a descendant of Heracles, who's a descendant of Zeus, etc. Like making yourself divine is an age-old, tried and true practice in settings of both real and fantastical. So said he can work miracles. He declares yourself the son of God and can work miracles. That does sound familiar, doesn't it? So that's kind of neat. And this is one of several mentions of krakens being drawn to the surface thanks to large amounts of blood. George is dropping those hints of what happens when there's lots of blood in the sea, and associating that with the Ironborn. And speaking of the Forsaken chapter, and exciting. Yes. So speaking of Euron and Aeron as well, Euron knew to get rid of Aeron because of stuff like this. He's like, he knew his history. He knows how much of a hold the drowned priests have on the Ironborn. He's like, I can't let this get out of hand. I can't, this priest was crowned. That's pretty unusual. Like Baelor the Blessed was crowned, but he's a Targaryen. Like, how often is a septon crowned, or a religious leader had a crown put on their head? Not very often. And here it almost seemed normal. Whereas in other places, it'd be like, whoa, that is bizarre. This, it's like when Aeron, in Aeron's chapter, his first chapter, he hears Balon is dead. He's like, who should sit the Seastone chair? A bunch of his followers were like, you should. They went right to it. They're like, Aeron Damphair, King Aeron. And he's like, I was made to be a prophet. He's like, the drowned god made me to be a prophet, not a king. Blah, 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 blah. Which is why I know Euron is not fit, because it's like, don't put me on, but definitely don't put Euron on. Like, he's worse,
But his argument wasn't that a religious leader shouldn't be it. It just so happens I'm not the religious leader that should be it. Yeah.
Yes. And he still wields, and you can see he wields enormous power. It was just, he's like, you know what we should do? Kingsmoot. And the whole Iron Islands is like, yes, Kingsmoot, because of this one guy, this one priest. I mean, he is a Greyjoy. He's brother of the king. But still, it goes to show the power. Like, Tommen couldn't do that. He's the brother of a king.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not the best example. But still.
Renly couldn't have done it. Stannis couldn't have done it.
Yeah, like they did a lot, but they couldn't do this, right? So Euron is kind of doing a new old way. Like, he calls for the Kingsmoot. It backfires because Euron wins the Kingsmoot anyway. And how does he win the Kingsmoot? By promising to do what Aegon did. He's like, Asha's like, you dumb brother. Aegon had dragons. He's like, no, you're the dumb one, sister. Niece. I've got dragons, or at least I've got a way to get them with this here horn that you all will believe works. And maybe it does, actually, but she didn't see that coming, like, oh, okay, really? Dragons? Yeah, never mind that these dragons are tiny and are not instruments of conquest nearly the means of Balerion, but it is a parallel. And Euron also got rid of Corin Volmark before the Kingsmoot, who had this bloodline. The Hoare dynasty, the one that's even 300 years later had some power, had some sway in there. And he's like, that's one guy. Euron had his plan to win the Kingsmoot, but he still didn't want this guy to participate. He still kind of took this guy out, removed him from the picture. He mostly he didn't care about what the other people were going to say, because he knew they weren't going to sway anyone. He's like, the one guy, the lonely light guy, just starts babbling. The one Harlaw guy or not Volmark guy, Black Tide guy just talks and talks and talks. Everybody gets bored. Asha uncorks root vegetables. Victarion is boring and just says, "I'll be like Balon, who lost," and so they're not. Euron's like, I'm not worried about what they're gonna say, but he was worried about what Aeron would say, which is why he captured him and why everyone's like, where did Aeron go? What happened to Aeron? Did he die on the way home to his home planet like Poochie? Well, that's an ongoing situation. So Euron knew where the power, who to shut up and who to let talk to best win. He understands his people, right? And this is something that is important here for us to understand, because Aegon is dealing with this in a way that he doesn't have that experience for. He doesn't know how to manipulate the Ironborn in ways that a Ironborn who've grown up amongst them would. An ambitious, cunning manipulator like Euron. Aegon isn't really like that. And I don't mean that in a good way. Like, he just isn't like Euron. That's a pretty low bar. Lodos is a real piece of work, though. The guy's like the shepherd, who you haven't met yet, Sean. That's the Dance of the Dragons religious leader. He's like the High Sparrow of the Ironborn, or again, like a Jesus figure, where, I mean, many Ironborn died for him. Just gave up their lives. Like you jump off a wall. Okay. Drown yourself. Okay. That kind of, he had that kind of sway over people.
They didn't die for him like charging into battle. They died for him just to prove their devoutness or whatever.
Yeah, or that too. Both battle and that. And so that's why this is part of why it's such a strange time in the Iron Islands. You have a drowned priest as king, and they're fighting each other when they're not supposed to do that. You hear they're fighting each other so badly that there's krakens and blood in the water, and it's wild. Like some priests might be saying that's a good thing. The krakens are signs of God. the drowned god has sent his steeds to us, or whatever. How do they refer to krakens? So yeah. Again, this may have been intentional on Aegon's part. Let them tear each other apart, come in later when they're weaker, and then settle things. Regardless of why he did it, this will be the state of affairs until the second year of his reign. Not 2 full years, but during the second year of his reign is when he finally comes to settle that. We'll come back to it at that point. Now, let's spend the rest of this episode on Dorne, chopping off as much of Dorne as we can, because the war's not going to start for a while. So we'll talk about the lead up to it, and the actual war with Dorne will not end until 10 AC? But it's not going to start right away either. This wasn't violent at first. As violent and nasty and all out as it gets, it doesn't start off that way. It's always been a bit of a realm apart from the others. The North is sort of like that too, with geography and different beliefs and culture. And like we said, so is the Iron Islands. So geography's created a buffer, and those cultural microcosms bloom because of that separation. And it's been that way for so long. The separation is less in some ways. Obviously, the North and the Iron Islands have their own religion, and Dorne doesn't. But there's less difference in ethnic origin as well. Though the Rhoynar are not found in large numbers elsewhere, most Dornish have common ancestors with the rest of Westeros, right? And all First Men, etc. And the separation is also a big part of why the submissions and kneelings north of the Red Mountains was not compelling enough to force their surrender. Like, well, just because they bent the knee doesn't mean we have to. If they were your counterparts, like, well, the Reach bent the knee, so the Stormlands will too. Because they're similar. They're way more similar as a cultural group. Stormlanders and Rivermen and the Reach and the Vale have way more in common than they do with the Dornish, even though there are plenty of things to point that they have in common.
Not just culturally, but I don't know how to say this, geographically.
The way they live,
think maybe
like day to day, foods they eat, things like that.
Yeah. The Riverlands maybe are a little less in the parallel I was trying to draw earlier, how like the Reach and other areas would be have more interconnected societies, right?
Yes.
I feel like the Riverlands are more of some isolated communities that get lumped together, and that's kind of how I feel about maybe the North and Dorne, whereas others are more complete interconnected societies.
Yeah.
And when you have that, when you have a complete interconnected society, you're more susceptible to dragons.
Yeah.
Than when you're spread out rural communities, right?
And when you are already, you have that cultural connection that, like you said, they're doing it, so we will too. They made that decision. It seems smart. We will too. It reflects our cultural values the same way as it does them. They're used to having this central authority it's not essential to the whole to the entire continent, but it is central to the region they live in. Whereas Dorne, as we've said, A, they haven't had a central authority nearly as long. B, that central authority isn't as strong. So they've already valued their independence more. So they're united by this ideology of independence, relative independence, more so than any of the other regions, with the possible exception of the Iron Islands, because they have that whole every captain is a king on the deck of his own ship thing. But it's a different kind of independence, because it's not a national independence. It's more of a, like, my ship. A ship isn't a nation, right? It's different in that sense. So they value their freedom and independence more. Like the wildlings, the free folk, are maybe our best bet here. Their knees do not bend as easily. Like, if you'd expect, like, you see a number of times where the cultural friction between people south of the wall and north of the wall gets off pace, right? Like, where Jon kneels to Mance and they just laugh at him, like, what are you doing, man? Like, we don't do that here, like, you goofball. He's like, don't call him my lord. He calls Corin half-hand my lord, and Corin's like, I'm not, I mean, he's not even free folk. He's just like, I'm a ranger. He doesn't even get that difference, that's within his own people. But it's just, things are done differently north of the wall. Like, it's just a culture apart from most of the Seven Kingdoms. I mean, the wall is really far from most of the rest of society, so that makes sense. But Jon brings that with him until he starts to learn not to do that. But it's hilarious when he bends the knee he doesn't even bend the knee to Mance. He bends to Tormund, right? He sees the wrong guy. He's like, oh yeah, wrong. Oh yeah, you're Mance? Oh, my bad. And Tormund's just laughing, they're all laughing at him. And Ygritte too is like, you just had to have someone, you're just looking for someone to kneel to, huh? You just gotta those kneelers' knees, gotta kneel to somebody. So the Dornish are like, yeah, our knees aren't itching to bend. A lot of days, like, the Dornish are more like the type who, you might not see your lord more than, like, or even deal with him more than once a year. Whereas, like, a river lord, there's a lot more back and forth with, like, the levies and the harvests and all this other stuff. And yeah, they're just less connected even in their day-to-day lives. So it's pretty important. So Aegon, so the farther you are, just the way they live makes them less susceptible to dragons. They're already not a culture that masses huge armies to fight each other, because it's hard to have big armies in the desert in the first place. It's just doesn't make sense logistically. You can't, like, where are you going to get enough water and food to maintain that host? And with all this independence, why would there even be a big army? Like, where is this coming from? So they're naturally more predisposed to stand up to dragons, because their method of war isn't a huge disadvantage. The way they are used to fighting doesn't make them an automatic loss, right? Whereas the way the Reach and the Riverlands, the way they fight, it just sets them up to lose. Whereas the Dornish, guerrilla tactics, hiding, sneaking, ambushing, that doesn't present a set of disadvantages to facing dragon. In fact, that's a good way to go about facing dragon. It might actually work. And it hadn't been tested yet. No one had tried this guerrilla style warfare against the dragons yet. The Dornish like, hey, we're good at this. We haven't seen that it works. When the Hightowers bent the knee, they were like, everyone tried. We tried nightly combat in a number of different ways, and none of it worked. The Dornish can't say that. They can't say, well, we tried our way of war and it didn't work. No, it hasn't been tried yet. They haven't tried yet. So they're not willing to surrender until they've tried. Well, they weren't even willing to surrender after that. But definitely not before. Clearly, Aegon and his sisters expected otherwise, though. They walked in. They said one dragon and one rider. I don't think they would have just done that if they expected otherwise, but that is what happened. They were mistaken. Quote.
Rhaenys Targaryen had no such easy conquest. A host of Dornish spearmen guarded the Prince's Pass, the gateway through the Red Mountains, but Rhaenys did not engage them. She flew above the pass, above the red sands and the white, and descended upon Vaith to demand its submission, only to find the castle empty and abandoned. In the town beneath its walls, only women and children and old men remained. When asked where their lords had gone, they would only say, away.
So let's look at where Vaith is on the map. It's a pretty neat location here. Their sigil's a little bit like the Cleganes. Instead of 3 black dogs, they got 3 black leopards. Yeah, that's cool. So instead of capitulating, they'd kind of agreed tacitly to a countrywide strategy of just don't face the dragons, don't surrender. Just don't even talk to them, basically. And here on, the only one that would talk to them, well, we'll get to it in a minute. We'll see.
I wonder if House Vaith and House Santigar are very related. They both have leopards.
Oh,
It
do they?
really just speaks to like the
I didn't notice
idea of
that.
there being, because remember Spotted Silva's House Santigar, like
Oh, yeah.
they're leopards, but I just never considered the idea that Vaith and Santigar might have married, or maybe just
Yeah.
I never really thought about how much that speaks to how many leopards there must be or have been in Dorne.
That's a good point. One day we're going to do, animal stuff, more animal stuff, and regional animals and Westerosi animals, Essosi animals. That would be neat to kind of use sigils as a way to try to figure out maybe what type of animals actually live in that area
or live,
or did.
Because like it's pretty easy to see like people having like over hunted the leopards because they're so like distinct. Yeah, it's really easy to imagine that having happened. So there's very few or something now.
Good call.
Or something from the Rhoynar having brought over. Maybe I don't know, but maybe there aren't many leopards there in the first place. Like there aren't any lions in England, but so many of the crests of the royal families have lions in them.
That's a great point. That totally we could look that maybe there were leopards in Essos and along the Rhoyne or something. It seems likely enough that are there desert leopards? I think so. I don't know.
This could be a good question for George at some point.
It'd be interesting to think about. Yeah.
So Rhaenys might have been a little confused. She shows up at Vaith and they're like, they're not here. And she'd be like, well, that's weird. Like, because it's not just the lords are away, it's like everyone's away. There's like some older people, some children, no one noble, no one to take as a hostage. Not that she could take a hostage anyway. She's by herself on her dragon. Like, how's she gonna strap a hostage on her saddle? I mean, I guess she could do that, but that's a little weird. So
it'd be a little risky physically getting a hostage.
Yeah, exactly. And so she would be like, I wonder what's going on here. She would have, this is what she'd be thinking about while flying to the next castle. Like, what are they doing here? What's their game? Why are they, like, am I going to have this happen again? If I fly to another castle, are they going to also not be there? Well, let's see what happened next. Quote.
Rhaenys followed the river downstream to God's Grace, seat of House Illyrian, but it too was deserted. On she flew. Where the green blood met the sea, Rhaenys came upon the planky town where hundreds of pole boats, fishing skiffs, barges, houseboats, and hulks sat baking in the sun, joined together with ropes and chains and planks to make a floating city. Yet only a few old women and small children appeared to peer up at her as Meraxes circled overhead.
So let's also look at these locations on the map just to situate ourselves. And you can see where she came from and where she went. She went from Vaith down to God's Grace and near Planky Town. Of course, the people of Planky Town might feel a little vulnerable with the dragon around and all these ships and their livelihoods. Just one breath of Meraxes could wipe out, like a third of them and start a fire that might wipe out most of the rest. But of course, that wasn't her business. She wasn't there to destroy them, not yet. And they weren't there to kill her, right? They could have. She's by herself. She's walking into castles by herself without a guard. If they had wanted to kill her, they could have. But they clearly didn't go straight to that option. They're definitely going to try that later, but it's not their first move. I assume because they didn't want it to become a blood debt situation right away. Kill one of Aegon's sisters and he's not going to be able to do anything other than bring massive fire and sword down on you. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to maybe find a third option, a way to dissuade the conquest, but not a way to encourage revenge, So the staying away method is what we see here.
I'm going to say, before you take the map down real quick, just because I was thinking about it, looking at it, just going back to what we were saying earlier about the differences in the cultures and how the geographic regions kind of preserve that, and how I was saying that Dorne is more this loose union of a bunch of different cultures rather than an interconnected society like, the West or something. Just think about how different and far away Planky Town and Blackmoat are. or Blackmont rather.
Yes,
Like
they're
this
very far
coastal town versus
Right.
buried in the middle of the mountains. And the distance between them, I wish I knew a little bit better, but that's probably as far as from the Reach to Winterfell, right?
It's very
just
far.
left-right difference instead of, east-west instead of north-south.
Maybe not quite that far, but very far, yeah.
But if someone in Sunspear makes some proclamation or says, send an envoy to me or gather an army, think how long it takes for that message to get to Blackmoat or the Tower of Joy or Sandstone. Just sending that message and then the response to it. And it's so much harder for Sunspear to have the same sort of direct control over its envoys than, say, the Reach over Oldtown or Oldtown over one of its bannermen, or I think even Winterfell over...
I think you mostly still have ravens with messages, which wouldn't be too bad. But you're right. But obviously not all messages go by raven. Like most messages don't go by raven because most people don't have a maester and trained ravens to. But
say the raven can get there fast and they're not affected by the heat of the desert or going across the heights of the mountains. But what if the message is, we're having a feast. Send your prince and 4 soldiers or whatever. Then they have to cross the mountains, cross the desert. It's
crazy to think about how far ahead you have to send the invites out for medieval parties.
And that's something that they might be excited to do. What if it's like we're gathering army to go attack the Dragon Lords or something, or we're setting up a defense against the Dragon Lords or whatever it is. You could see how the message might be, hey, Blackmont, just hide out. Just hide out. So we'll see what happens. We're gonna hide out. You hide out.
I really like that idea.
This organized front against the Targaryens.
I agree because it does seem like they may have had a united strategy. Like I floated the idea that maybe this is just kind of because they share an ideology. This is how they're gonna handle it. But it seems like this was a concerted effort that they had discussed. The fact that no one was there to meet her except for one very specific person who was there to meet her, as we'll see in a second, and just so happens to be the leader of Dorne. So it sounds like this was prearranged. Like no one talked to her, let her come all the way to me, and I'll give her the final message, which is, well, let's hear it.
Well, before we do this message, can I just say something about this map?
Absolutely.
Sean, you were bringing up the distance from Blackmont to Plankytown and looking at it there. I just wanted to and you were comparing it to the Reach versus Winterfell. I just want you to visualize that, picture the end of the desert to the tip of the desert. That's the distance you're talking about. Look at Highgarden up to Winterfell. It's 4 or 5 times more.
That is much farther.
It's much. I just thought it would be helpful for you to see it visually right here. Ultimately, anyways, just that.
I might have picked a bad example, but I think you can easily pick 2 cities that are far apart. They're clearly far apart.
White Harbor as far as White Harbor to the Erie is probably about similar.
Yeah. How about from the Sisters to Dragonstone?
Sure, that's really
maybe
far.
that is maybe still even twice as far. Maybe 3/4 as much. But anyways, sorry to have a digression. I just wanted to. It just boggles the mind sometimes how big the world actually is. When
I'm always down for a map discussion.
Yeah. Just when you see it, when you see it zoomed in on Dorne, it looks so big, and then you see it here in Westeros, and you're like, that's just a tiny little.
I'll go as long as we're getting into the weeds of this, though, and just to defend myself a little bit, maybe. I wonder if the North is stretched out, kind of like our maps of Canada are.
Yeah, I actually do think that that's possible, that there is some slight distortion just because
it's possible. But we're told the North is larger than not just, and that's not because of maps. That's just because of travel. And think of how long it takes for the Northern host to gather and all that. That's partly because of the difficulty of messages and getting, places where ravens don't go. But also, some of that would be worse in a desert scenario or in the
right. I was going to say, aside from the straight up distance, there's also the terrain. It's easier to travel across these forests and fields and against deserts and mountains. So.
Plus, there are rivers to cross, and even though there's deserts, there's also rivers to cross. Yeah. So anyway, it's not a simple thing. You can't just look at the map and be sure. That's one thing we can tell from this mini debate here, discussion. Is that it's not just as simple as looking at distance, but that definitely gives us a ballpark figure. It definitely helps. And also, it's a good time to remind folks that you can, if you're listening on Spotify, or if you're watching the video, you've seen all this. But if you're listening on Spotify, nowadays you can click a button and turn the video on and then turn it back off. So you're not using a lot of bandwidth. Your phone isn't using as much battery. But if you want to just briefly be able to see what we're talking about and then have the screen off the whole time, you have that option nowadays on Spotify. You click the video feed on, look at what we're talking about, and then click it off when it's just us in front of our microphones again. So I want to just take an opportunity every once in a while to remind people that that's an option, because that's a fairly new thing in the podcast world, to be able to have video at all. But to have video doesn't mean, just because people think of it as all or nothing, but you don't have to. You can have the video on just for a few moments at a time.
Yes.
If for some reason you can't have it on the whole time.
So now I can read my quote.
Yeah. Yes. Now it's backing up to where we were, which is the next step in Rhaenys' travails and treks around Dorne. Quote.
Finally, the queen's flight took her to Sunspear, the ancient seat of House Martell, where she found the Princess of Dorne waiting in her abandoned castle. Maria Martell was 80 years of age, the maesters tell us, and had ruled the Dornishmen for 60 of those years. She was very fat, blind, and almost bald, her skin sallow and sagging. Argilac the Arrogant had named her the Yellow Toad of Dorne, but neither age nor blindness had dulled her wits. I will not fight you, Princess Maria told Rhaenys, nor will I kneel to you. Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that. I shall, Rhaenys replied, but we will come again, princess, and the next time we shall come with fire and blood. Your words, said Princess Maria, ours are unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril. Thus, queen and princess parted, and Dorne remained unconquered. It's a different kind of princess and the queen.
Yeah, that's true. The princess and the queen. I can only hear Ian Glenn saying that in his great delivery. The princess and the queen. Yes, because Ian Glenn / Jorah did read The Princess and the Queen. Pretty cool. So, Sean, you had in our notes, you're wondering about the phrase fire and blood here. Now, of course, the phrase, we don't know how
because I knew that they didn't have a sigil before, right? That was something that they came up with as part of this conquest.
The words came at the same time.
Did they have words before?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I wondered if this is where they were coming from, or they must have just come up with these words. This is was this the first time it got run out there? You know,
I think it might be the first time it was run out there. Yeah, because it's neat that that she says it that way. It sounds like another one of those examples where the historians kind of just wrote what they're like. There's no witness to this. You know, this is not like it's specifically said when Harren and Aegon have a conversation. It says the maesters were there, so they know exactly what was said. That's the only time they say the maesters were there, so we know exactly what was said. So all these other times, this is made up dialogue. Of course, it's made up dialogue, but I mean, you see this in history books all the time, real history books where invented dialogue is inserted by historians. It is extremely common. I had that day when, as a young person interested in history, I remember reading ancient history, but just reading like a battle speech before some battle. I don't even remember what it was, and it just dawned on me. He's like, how do they know what he said? Of course, they don't. The answer is they don't have any idea what he said. They completely just put words in the mouths of these powerful people just to make it, I don't know why, just to make it feel more realistic. Just to put us there.
A bunch of different reasons why. Yeah. Entertainment,
I like
propaganda.
It. Yeah. I'm not against it, but we should see it for what it is. And this is what George is doing, following a real world tradition here. So it makes it having them
find the truth too. There might be maybe stories of what was said were passed down, even I don't really know.
Yeah.
And whatever the story is probably gets manipulated a little bit to make it sound more exciting or interesting or appropriate for the morality of their culture, you know.
Do they really say their slogans like that? We're unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You know, like that's our words. Your words are fire and blood. Were they really chatting via slogan? Maybe. I mean, it's possible because it does fit the situation. It's like, well, our words say we don't do that. I was like, well, our words say we're going to come make you. Like, all right, then we'll see whose words are stronger. Slogan fight, you know, slogan battle, slogan wars. So yeah, this was maybe the first time that the word fire and blood were used, like projected that way. Because you're right, they didn't have those words until they decided to be more Westerosi. Like, we need a banner and house words like all these other houses, so let's do it. And so yeah, this is them projecting that out into the world. So according to Fire and Blood, when this is happening, when Maria of Dorne is saying, nope, to Rhaenys, around the same time this is happening, Aegon is being crowned at Oldtown. He may have already been crowned. So they may have been, again, we were talking about how that was a little premature. It may have been very premature. She may not have even spoken with Meria yet, or Miria yet. So he's calling himself king of all Westeros, and Maria's just waiting there to be like, no, not all of Westeros. And this is why we suggested maybe a little bit of overconfidence, because Aegon's not going to win them over by violence, nor will any of his descendants. 190 years before a full submission, and that's through marriage. And like I said, it may have made their resistance all the more fierce that he insulted them by claiming dominion without even coming to their country in the first place. Now, Miria, clearly named for Nymeria. It's Nymeria.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite details, by the way. I just want to shout that out.
Presents another potential angle for us here in explaining Dornish resistance. It's quite possible their resistance would have been just as fierce without this angle, but I think this matters. Nymeria led her refugees away from where? From the destruction of the Rhoynish cities by who? The Valyrians, the Dragon Lords. They're very much predisposed to standing up or not bowing to Dragon Lords. Like, it's in their history. The people, all their royal family is named after. This is what they did. Like, it would be demeaning in a lot of ways, or it would insult their own history to give up, especially without a fight. Like, they fled all that way. They went through all those travels and travails. The Odyssey of the Rhoynar. It's their equivalent. And they're just going to bend the knee to the next to a Dragon Lord 600 years later without a fight after all that. What an insult to all they had gone through. All they had fought for to keep their culture alive, right? Like, that's, yeah, come on. You can't do that. I mean, I'm not there. I'm not in charge, but you would think that would matter a lot. Yeah, and there's all these names. It's not just Meria, right? Or Miria, there's Nymeros. The title is it's Nymeros Martell, right? Nymor is like her son or her. Yeah, there's just half of them are named after Nymeria, so they clearly value the thing she valued and hold her in high regard and the thing she stood for. So, what are they going to just become slaves of another set of Dragon Lords that they fought so hard to resist? Yeah, I just can't see it. Yeah, like. But Aegon seems to have ignored that. He seems to have understood the history of a lot of the other people he was going after. This looks like a pretty big oversight to not consider that the descendants of those who fled his ancestors would not submit so easily the second go round here, even though it's been 600 years or more. They clearly haven't forgotten. So I think there's definitely some oversight, some overconfidence, as well as maybe missing some important details. If they had thought some of these things through or been more aware of them, I think they would have known that they wouldn't be bending the knee so easily. That doesn't mean they wouldn't still approach it the same. We'll still, okay, we'll go through the motion, send an envoy, ask for your submission. You say no, back to the drawing board. Because it's not like it went straight to war after that either. It's not like war just immediately started. It's not like Rhaenys didn't fly home and say, okay, get the army ready, let's go. No, there was actually more to it, but we'll get to as the timeline moves forward. There was more peaceable attempts before it turned to war. So the violence doesn't start for quite a while still. And so there's a large number of reasons why the Dorne we've pointed out why the Dornish would see the situation different. Culture, geography, history, big one here with the Rhoynar, especially them. But beyond that, just their ability to resist, their confidence and understanding and their strategies and thinking maybe we have ways that will work in war that they don't. So Aegon was proved wrong. Like his advisors told him, here's another angle to this, by the way. Who are his advisors at this point? Who's telling him how to handle the Dornish? The Reach and the Stormlands, people who have a lot of bias, if not prejudice, if not straight up racism against the Dornish. So they're probably not going to give very good advice. Their advice might be tinged with that. Oh, well, we've been fighting, my lord or my king, your grace. We've been fighting these people for thousands of years. Let me tell you a few things about them. But then it's all just tinged with through the lens of war and raids and back and forth and bitterness and blood feuds and not an honest assessment of what they're capable of. It's like, oh, the Dornish, they're cowards. They always run away. That's why you should be worried. They're not cowardly. The fact that they won't face you is a problem. If they were just going to line up and face you, then then it will be easy because you'll just burn them like you burned anyone else that dared face you head on. But they're not, and that's why you should treat them differently. So yeah. Nina says this is why it's important not to read history backwards, that because Dorne was successful in resisting Targaryen conquest for nearly 2 centuries, the Targaryens were stupid for trying in the first place. No, it's not that simple. Yes, I think they made mistakes, but it's not like you said, Sean, in Aegon's defense, it did kind of seem like common sense to bend the knee, even though there's all this cultural separation, even though they're more stubborn, even though they value independence more. It's still Balerion and all of Westeros arrayed against them. That's still a lot to say, we can beat that. We can stand up to that. It's still common sense. Still argument to bend the knee is still very strong. So it's not
like a lot of the arguments you might use for why Dorne, quote unquote, shouldn't have bent the knee. They stand for Winterfell too, but Winterfell still bent the knee. So like the cultural differences, the history, the physical barrier, all this stuff. Yeah, Winterfell had all that too, and they still bent the knee. So
yeah, and just from the Dornish perspective, like maybe it was a bad idea to resist, but they weren't wrong if they could stand up to the dragons. They didn't beat the dragons, but the dragons didn't beat them either. I mean, Daeron the First came in later and conquered them for a few years, but that was also without actual dragons. That was regular military. So yeah. So again, I think comparing them to the free folk makes a lot of sense. Very hard to subjugate. They don't have population centers. The way they fight makes them less vulnerable. They're the Dornish of the North, or they're the free folk of the South, however you want to say it. And also, like if you think about this, Westerosi, to fight dragons, they would have to adapt. They're bad at adapting. They're just not. They just do things the way they've always done them. Westeros is very conservative in that regard. It's like, if it worked before, do it again, even though if everything is different, they'll still do the things that we've always done. Dorne's not quite the same. He was right to predict that the rest of Westeros would kind of just do what they've always done, and that wouldn't work. But Dorne also did what it always has done, and it did work to a certain point.
I want to bring a counterpoint there too, that it's not so much that they're not good at adapting, is that they are more established. Dorne is less established. They don't have big cities, right? Once you have a big city, I guess it's harder to adapt, but it's because you already made adaptations in ways that cause your society to thrive, right?
Yes.
Dorne isn't thriving. They haven't built a great sept. They don't have a citadel. They don't have, eventually they build water gardens, but hundreds of years later, I'm just saying that they don't, it's kind of like we said before, they don't have as much to lose. They don't have these big population centers. They don't have fields of wheat or whatever else, so.
Yeah, that's very true.
It's easier for them to adapt when they don't have as much to lose. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, remember how it was difficult for Daemon to defeat the crab feeder in both book and show version because they kept hiding in caves. It's a very good place to hide from a dragon. Caves. Like,
it's a good adaptation
into a cave. Yeah.
It's a good adaptation, but you're living in a cave.
Yeah, it's
right?
not good, but it will keep you alive, at least. It's a good place to hide, but it's not a good long-term solution, but it absolutely works in a pinch. And the Red Mountains are full of caves. Like, not all of Dorne is full of caves, because a lot of it's desert or waterways or whatever, but the places that have mountains, it's a good place to hide. And so at least it works in this. It's better than burning to death, that's for sure. So
another angle I want to take to make it, again, I'm presenting a counterpoint, but it's kind of like saying it, especially given how sudden it was for a dragon to show up. It's kind of like saying Japan wasn't good at adapting to the nuclear bomb. Like, no one's good at adapting to the nuclear bomb. Like,
how do you adapt?
I guess they could have all fled the cities and lived out in the woods and had crappy lives, and that would have been a way to adapt. But yeah,
they probably still.
We're not good at adapting to nuclear bombs. If someone drops a nuclear bomb on New York, the argument isn't, well, America's not good at adapting. You're like, no, nuclear bombs are hard to adapt to.
It's a lot to adapt to. Yeah, and besides, if you empty the cities of people, they're just going to be more encouraged to bomb it. They weren't. Yeah, it's just. So that's a big consideration here too. Like, when we hear about Aegon prior to the conquest, and there's that note in the book that says some believe Aegon had never left Dragonstone before the conquest, but that's not true because we know about him going to Lannisport and hawking on the Arbor and other things. None of those mentions are of him going to Dorne, which possibly feeds the theory that he had misconceptions about it, about how what their culture was like. He may have thought it was more similar than it was, or more different than it was, or who knows? Again, the hearing about them through the Reach and the Stormlands might have given him the wrong idea, and he didn't know better himself by not having gone there. So yeah, I think that's pretty important. So, and of course, as we said before, like you said about the big city thing too, even if they had a big city, they would be reluctant to destroy that because they want to rule it afterwards. They don't necessarily want to torch it. It still would be kind of a last resort. That it's a last resort we're almost going to see. So it's going to show how bad this war gets. They're not going to torch the Shadow City or Sunspear, but almost everything else is going to happen. So Aegon is going to show, well, it is in his wheelhouse. Like, I can go that far. You know, he doesn't want to necessarily, but it's almost like the don't make me do it kind of things. Like, well, no one's making you do it. But that is the threat that he's making. Like, if you quote unquote make me do this, I will do it. And I'm capable. You've seen my dragon and you know what it's capable of.
I had a thought in here that I'm adding to. It's occurring to me, something I brought up in a past episode, is that, remember, Aegon did intend to go down to Dorne more quickly.
Yes.
Stop to go confront Torn.
Yeah.
What if right after burning Harrenhal, Aegon had gone down to Dorne?
Ooh.
Where, one, they might not have had as much time to come up with a plan, and two, Harrenhal burning would have been the story. Right now, the story is he burned Harrenhal, but then did he burn Oldtown? No. Did he burn the Reach? No. Winterfell? No. Yeah, it's kind of moved past the burning cities down thing, huh? Maybe he won't burn down Sunspear. Maybe he won't scorched earth this. Maybe they were kind of taking advantage of what I think was correct for Aegon to not have the scorched earth policy. But once they realized that, they're like, let's just leave the cities. He's got no one to conquer. I don't think he's going to burn them down. It's not what he's doing, right? Like, it eventually shifts gears,
and it just doesn't.
That might add
to
why they didn't. It might add to why they did what they did. And why it might have gone so much differently if he had been able to go straight there after Harrenhal instead of dealing with the north and fill the fire and everything first.
Yeah. And Harrenhal is just a much bigger, better example too, because it's so centrally located, it's so huge. Like, destroying one of the Dornish castles, which is going to happen, multiples, it just doesn't have that same effect on the rest of the country, especially because the rest of the country is already submitted at this point besides Dorne. Yeah. So yeah, that lesson doesn't ring as loudly. It doesn't, nor does it stand the test of time. Like, we don't hear about all the burned castles in Dorne to this day, even though they were burned. Even some of them were burned. We don't hear about all the lasting damage and how that serves as an example because they're all relatively remote. Like, the story Song of Ice and Fire doesn't go there, except for a little bit with Arianne, and even then we don't see the evidence of this destruction. It's all, I guess, been rebuilt, or it just doesn't come up.
And one other piece that we had brought up before too is that if he had gone straight to Dorne, in a weird way, they might have felt like, we're the next most important. He came to us, so we respect it. Okay, but when he saves them for last, like, screw you, man. You're not going to burn us down anyway.
And they ended up getting second primary. That ended up being a problem for the other houses when eventually they were brought in by marriage. They got concessions that the other regions didn't, and that was so they kind of like, we did get second place, y'all. The rest of y'all are behind us now because we get better tax situation. We're the royal family, all this. So it did kind of work out for them in that sense in the long run, as a country, as a nation holding out. The fact that they were able to withstand the dragons did get them a better deal, almost 200 years later, but it was a much better deal.
In the very long term. They might have ended up with a better deal in the long term also if they had kneeled right away. Like, if all their people their homes hadn't been burned and everything. So
that's a really tough call. Yeah, we have no idea what would have been the outcome of that. And they went into it with a different strategy, because this is interesting too. Like, they maybe because they saw what happened, or because it's just naturally how they handle warfare. The Reach played to win. They played to beat Aegon. The West played to beat Aegon. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to defeat him. They didn't, of course, but that was their goal. I'm not sure that Dorne is trying to beat Aegon so much as aim for a stalemate. It's a totally different strategy. They're trying to just turn him off of the idea of conquering them rather than straight up beating him. It's like make it not worth it, rather than actually beat him. Like actually defeat him in a pitched battle. They're not even going to try to meet him in a pitched battle. But if they're going to win, it's going to be on an entirely different set of terms. But to me, it seems like they're less trying to win and just trying to not lose, which is different. That's different. Playing for a stalemate is different. Like if you go into a game of chess, aiming for a stalemate, the strategy is very different. I mean, it's rare that you would want to do that, but there are times when you would, like in a chess tournament, maybe, and certain points matter more. Like you're just trying to finish ahead of someone else to make a cut. I don't know. But yeah, warfare is similar in that the strategy you're taking determines a lot of how you might win or lose. And your opponent might mess up because they're thinking you're playing to win when you're not. And that screws up their strategy. So that's kind of interesting to think about it from that sense.
I want to get too deep into chess, but time is a factor also. Sometimes when there's always time limits. And if you get down to a certain amount of time, sometimes a person that realizes that there's not enough time to actually get a checkmate wins because they start playing quicker and runs the other person out of time rather than get a checkmate, if that makes sense. And in a way, you could argue time's a factor in war too when it comes to like winter coming or supplies running out or one other thought I had about this that hadn't occurred to me just now when you're talking about going for a stalemate is that George lived through Vietnam. That was sort of Vietnam's tactic. They were way outclassed in almost every factor, but they just hid away. They didn't. It was a different sort of battle than World War II or whatever. And then the U.S. couldn't even fight it. Had limitations how it could fight. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I think there's a lot of parallels here.
You're right. No, that is a very good parallel.
At least in the back of his mind, yeah.
You're totally right. Yeah, they used like the parallel to caves is there with tunnels. The Viet Cong made huge amounts of tunnels, and that's like a low tech but very effective thing that was just a terror to American soldiers as well. As
we were napalming the heck out of their country, and
which is part of why they use tunnels, right? Because like the napalm isn't going to get down in there, and the same like dragon fire can't penetrate into the caves too deeply. So yeah, that's a very good parallel. So, all right, so we'll call that a wrap on our progress for today. That's a good place to end with Dorne. When we come back to Dorne, it will be to discuss the outbreak, the beginning of negotiations, and then eventually the outbreak of hostilities. That's all going to happen under the reign of the dragon. We're basically out of the conquest phase now.
Technically, we could come back to Dorne if people vote on a Dornish topic.
That's true.
Just saying, if you're feeling Dorne.
So like I said earlier in this episode, we'll be off of Fire and Blood for about 6 or 7 weeks. Return right before the beginning of 2024. In the meantime, we will have a variety of other episodes. So it's not a break from episodes, just a break from Fire and Blood. We've been down in the trenches with Aegon and his sisters for a while, and normally we like to mix things up with our topics a bit more than that. So let's do that. Let's not get too over focused on one part of what is such a vast and diverse selection that we have to choose from. But we will certainly pick it back up where we left off and have a lot of fun with that as well. So let's work our way out here. A couple of bits from Julie A. She says, plus the oral traditions from the descendants of the Rhoynar, they'd have passed down stories of escaping dragons in Valyrian times, and the assumption that it's possible would be known. That's true. They have proven in their history that they could outlast or survive the dragons. Even though they didn't beat them, they weren't beaten by them either. They escaped them. They weren't enslaved. They weren't killed. Well, a lot of them were, but as a race, they weren't. And Julia again says, per PBS, leopards are the only known species that live in desert and rainforests of big cats, I assume.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it might be mammals. I don't know. But because someone else.
Oh, they live in both desert and rainforest.
Yeah.
Oh, the combination of the two.
Yeah,
because lions live in deserts but not rainforests.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, exactly.
That is interesting. That is a very different.
Yeah, I'm sure like panthers live in, like panthers might live in rainforest, but not a desert and vice. Like I was like, I can't think of any other like mammals that like elephants don't.
I can think of one immediately. I bet there's others. Humans.
Yeah, that's what someone said immediately was humans, but
it might be species
we were clearly
of cats,
speaking.
But
No, I don't think it's species of cats. I think it's the combo, and I think it's of just animals. Yeah.
There might be, there might be some bird species, but it would probably be, there's probably a difference in that bird, just like there's a leopard is not the same as a cheetah, but they're related. So
yeah, there might be other delineated things. It's not quite the same species.
That's neat. That's very neat.
Yeah.
All right. The trivia question again was, who gave Miria her nickname, the Yellow Toad? The answer is Argilac the Arrogant, as was reminded in the quote, one of the quotes that we read today. That's right. So next week, I don't know what our episode will be next week. We're going to be posting a poll, so it will be a surprise. And if you want to participate in the poll and future polls, well, sign up for our Patreon and get not only that, but bonus episodes and lots of other benefits that come with your support. You give us support, and we give you bonus content.
My question for you is these: do you know the poll topics yet?
Not yet.
Interesting.
Not yet.
Okay. Well,
I was planning on doing them last night, but I've been sick this week, and my energy level has been terrible. I feel pretty good today. I think I might be finally over it. But
yeah, you seem a lot. But whether you just turned it on for the stream and like we might stop recording and Aziz just like deflates instantly. But your energy level seems better. Your mood and everything.
I do always get hyped up for the stream. I do love that, and I do have a coffee. Yes, but yes, I do tend to pour all my energy into these live streams.
Lolotop points out there are also Siberian leopards and urban leopards too.
Whoa!
But crazy. I wonder, they might have the biggest gamut, the biggest range of like climates. Actually, leopards. It's interesting.
Well, this episode is over, but if you want to stay immersed in Westeros or Essos and Martin World, whatever your name for it, we've got some suggestions. A couple of Patreon episodes, The Last Storm, which is a part of the Conquest you may not have heard, that we did separately, and had a Jim McGeehan, our military expert, in to be our helper there. The Red Kraken episode, the Red Kraken's run takes place during the Dance of the Dragons, but it's a separate story. It doesn't really have a whole lot directly to do with the actual events of the dance. It's more of a side story. So we covered it separately. And in that episode, there's a lot of the same things we talked about here about what's going on in the Ironborn. The Red Kraken was the first one to bring the old way back. Of the many people who brought it back, who tried to bring it back, the Red Kraken was the first one to actually do it. And he was more successful than even a lot of the ones that did it later, with the possible exception of Euron, which is still ongoing. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But the Red Kraken was enormously successful, and he had a political mind several levels beyond most Ironborn. He understood the politics of the realm and how the blacks and greens would go at each other in a lot of ways that was very savvy. He played them. He managed to play them off each other a little bit and get the best deal for himself, which enabled him, of course, to go a-reaving and raiding and plundering and taking of many salt wives, and how the West resisted him and how that all went, and how the return of the old way and how important that was to the Ironborn and how ready they were to be unleashed again, and why that made things so bloody. That's, well, why that episode is fun. And it was co-written by Radio Westeros. So there's an extra benefit to that as well. All right. As well as our Nymeria series. Of course, we talked about Nymeria quite a bit in this one. This might be a good time for y'all to head back to that pair of episodes. We still have a third part of that series that we are many years behind on. One day we'll get to it. But we covered all of her journey. We covered everything in Valyria and Sithorios on all the different trips to different islands. But we didn't cover what happened when she got to Dorne. So one day we're going to do that, and that'll be fun to finish. But we got those first two for you, and I think you'll enjoy them. Even if you've heard them already, it's a good time to check them out again. Sean? I'm sorry? Oh, a cat.
Yeah.
A cat from Sean would be cool. Also, of course, our episodes before the dragons, under the dragons, on the episode on Balerion, the episode on Dragonstone, the episode on House Velaryon and House Celtigar. Those would be pretty big. And, of course, the episode on the Century of Blood. A lot of stuff that takes place right before the Conquest. And, of course, our episode on Mantaris, which is another patrons-only episode that discusses blood magic and strange doings in the East and fallout from the Doom. Lots of cool stuff there. I'm very happy with those episodes, and I hope you are too. Looks like I'm really trying to vamp here to give time for Sean to get a cat. And it looks like,
well, I can say something here. One, we just got a super chat from a long expected soundscape.
Oh, hey, Jordan, how's it going?
Jordan is working on, we got a cat now. Working on Dunk and Egg, correct?
Yeah, he's working on Dunk and Egg. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. Which is one of the things we'll discuss when we have our TV show roundup episode. We'll discuss where the Dunk and Egg show is proceeding, and of course House of the Dragon and other news related to those two shows and other stuff.
I also feel obliged to tell everyone we were supposed to go to the corn maze on Thursday, but Aziz, obviously, he just said he was sick this week, so we did it, but we're going to go tomorrow. It's still open, just barely. There's only a little bit of time before they harvest the corn.
Yeah.
Oh, look at the kitty, though. It's been Cora a bunch lately, huh, Sean? She's just the most
She's got a white
amenable to being grabbed.
And to stay in place.
Yeah, same place. Yeah, it's often her.
Which as she
Cute
squirms.
girl. Yeah, someone says a wee leopard. Yeah, the brown leopard.
Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks to those of you who support us either on Patreon or Spotify or through PayPal. Our website contains all the ways that you can do that, all the ways you can find links to our other episodes, all the ways you can find links to anything, any sponsor or product or item that we pointed you to, whether it's other books or other series or other episodes of ours. You can find it all at historyofwesteros.com. Thanks to Nina for her great notes, lots of valuable insight and input into the politics and the marriages and the writing process. Just a lot of things I talk to her about ahead of writing things. So even some of the things I've written were influenced by her. So can't thank her enough. Joey, Jesse, Bran, and Michael, you four, you as well, not two, T-O-O. You two as well have done great things for us. And I want to thank you for the music, for the maps, for the intro. Y'all are great. Our show feels so professional because of y'all. And to our Bengineer, giving us sound quality assistance here and there and occasionally everywhere. We must as well. Thank you for that. And to the rest of you for listening, we appreciate it. And we'll be back with more next time. You know what to do. Until then. Valar Rereadus.